Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now beginning with story 1, the origins of medieval ice fishing. You sit in stillness. The wind howls across a wide, frozen lake. The ice beneath you creaks gently as the sun barely warms the horizon. The scene could be from yesterday or from 900 years ago. Long before modern gear or sonar, long before heated tents or synthetic lines, people found ways to catch fish beneath ice. They had no other choice. The history of ice fishing in the Middle Ages is not the kind taught in schools. There are no great battles here, no kings in shining armor. Only the quiet struggle of survival, ingenuity, and the forgotten methods of ordinary people who knew that, in winter, fish meant life. Early ice fishing before the High Middle Ages, 400–1000 AD. Our story begins not in a kingdom, but in the silence of the north. Across early medieval Europe, from the snowy reaches of Scandinavia to the frost-locked lakes of Ruse, communities developed winter fishing techniques. These were born out of necessity. Hunting could not be relied upon. Crops were frozen, and trade routes often closed for months. So they fished, even when the lakes froze over. Archaeological evidence from Finland and Sweden shows that people used sharpened bone hooks and spears tipped with antler. These tools, shaped by fire and stone, were tethered with gut or sinew. The fish caught, usually perch, pike, and trout, were smoked or dried, preserving them for the long months ahead. Fishing through ice required not only patience but planning. Ice had to be thick enough to walk on, but not so thick that drilling a hole took a full day. Without metal augers, they used chisels made of iron, or more often, a sequence of strikes with sharpened poles or stone axes. By the 7th century, communities along the Gulf of Bothnia had established seasonal routines, returning to favored fishing spots with the reliability of migrating birds. Some even cut channels into frozen rivers to guide fish toward narrow collection points, a primitive but effective trap. Tools of simplicity and survival. Imagine crafting a hook from the leg bone of a hare, then tying it with a sinew line, weighted with a pebble. It seems primitive, but it worked. Lines were typically made of twisted horsehair or fibers from bast, the inner bark of trees like linden or elm. These were surprisingly strong, if prone to freezing stiff in the cold. The bait, usually maggots, preserved worms, or bits of fish gut from the previous catch. Decoys were another subtle art. Some early communities carved small fish-shaped lures from bone or wood, dangling them in the cold water to attract larger fish. These lures were rarely found whole, only fragmentary pieces remain, but their existence suggests an early understanding of fish behavior. Notably, we find no standardization in tools. Each region, and often each family, crafted its own methods. A fisherman in 10th century Novgorod might not recognize the tools of a Laplander, though their goals were the same. Geography and the ice fishing belt. Ice fishing in the Middle Ages was mostly confined to the northern ice belt, the areas of northern and eastern Europe that reliably froze each winter. These included Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Finland; the Baltic states, Kiev and Ruse; northern Scotland and Orkney; parts of Central Europe with deep winters. Climatic records suggest a period of colder temperatures during the so-called Late Antique Little Ice Age, circa 536–660 AD, and later, another cooling during the early medieval period. These made winters more severe but also more predictable, which was key for planning ice-based activity. Some of the oldest records of structured ice fishing practices come from the Sami people of northern Scandinavia. Though many Sami traditions were oral, early Christian missionaries wrote with both fascination and disapproval of their fishing methods. One monk in the 9th century described Sami men chanting low songs while peering into dark holes in the ice. which may refer to both spiritual rituals and practical fishing habits. When ice meant food, not sport. In the Middle Ages, fish was not a luxury, it was survival and in many cases a religious requirement. The Catholic Church dictated numerous fasting days and fish-only periods. For example, Lent required abstention from meat for 40 days. Ice fishing enabled compliance even in frozen regions. But more practically, fish were often the only source of protein available in midwinter. In famine years, salted or smoked pike might be the only thing standing between a village and starvation. The act of fishing was not just individual. In some areas, communities carved large square holes in frozen lakes and laid out dragnets, woven from bark fibers or hemp, to sweep under the ice. This required coordination, teamwork, and enormous labor. The nets, heavy and prone to tangling, had to be pulled by hand, yet the payoff could feed dozens. Small communities and the ice economy. Little is written in royal records about winter fishing. It was considered peasant labor, but in town records and monastery accounts, we find traces of this quiet activity. In a 12th century ledger from the monastery of St. Gallen, Switzerland, there's a record of 4 dozen smoked trout gathered by the brothers upon the lake in time of frost. Monks, bound by both hunger and rule, often became skilled at ice fishing. Elsewhere in what is now Estonia, taxation records from Danish rulers refer to fish dues collected in winter months. These may have been from under-ice catch, an economic recognition that winter fishing had value. Some communities bartered fish for grain or firewood. Others dried and sold their catch during thawing markets in spring. Still, most of this labor was unpaid, unwritten, and forgotten. Closing thoughts. As the firelight flickers and the ice groans under the weight of time, we're left with a question. How did these ancient methods evolve from bone hooks and bark lines into the more complex systems used in later medieval trade networks? A changing landscape, the rise of structured winter fishing. By the 11th and 12th centuries, northern Europe had begun to transform. Settlements grew larger. Trade routes, still unreliable in winter, began to connect previously isolated fishing communities. And with that came the slow codification of what had been instinctual. Ice fishing began to take on structure. This was not structure imposed from above, not yet. It began organically, through necessity, repetition, and knowledge passed from parent to child, elder to apprentice. What had once been a matter of pure survival was becoming a shared, and in some cases protected, skill set. With each generation, fishing in frozen water moved from desperation to expectation. In the icy winters of Finland, the Sami continued to refine their methods, not only for survival, but as part of their yearly rhythm of movement and subsistence. Ice fishing became a predictable part of the cycle. Meanwhile, in the West, fishing villages in Sweden and Norway built rudimentary shelters to protect fishermen from wind as they worked. These were not heated, nor comfortable, but they allowed longer fishing sessions. They marked the beginning of what would, centuries later, evolve into the modern ice shanty. But this transformation didn't happen evenly. Lords' laws and lakes. The Middle Ages were an age of hierarchy, and as organized fishing grew, so too did control over water rights. By the 12th century, lords and monasteries across Europe had begun to claim dominion over lakes and rivers, even when frozen. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, winter fishing became subject to regulation. While these laws rarely mentioned ice fishing by name, their enforcement did not freeze with the waters. Landowners realized that winter fishing, once invisible and unmonitored, held untapped value. In a fragmented region like the Duchy of Saxony, dozens of small lakes and ponds were privately owned. Monasteries especially capitalized on the fasting needs of the church, leasing fishing rights to local peasants for a share of the winter catch. In the Doomsday Book, 1086, The English crown recorded thousands of fisheries across its holdings. While this was primarily a tool for taxation, it included references to year-round access, which by implication covered ice fishing when applicable. A small record from 1192 in Denmark mentions 2 men fined for taking winter pike without tithe. This might be one of the earliest written references to an illegal ice fishing act. Suddenly, the act of drilling a hole in the ice was not just survival, it was political. Guilds and fishing rights. As the century turned, the fishing world slowly began to organize, particularly in more populated regions. In towns like Lübeck and Riga, fishing guilds formed, not as tightly organized as those of bakers or blacksmiths, but still powerful. Guilds set rules for when and where fishing could occur. They dictated what tools were permissible and often required seasonal payments. Winter fishing was typically assigned to specific members based on rotation or status. This maintained social order, but it also created inequality. A poor man in 13th century Riga might be fined for using a hand chisel in a lake designated for net fishing, even if he caught only enough to feed his family. Enforcement varied, but the principle was clear. Access to fish was no longer a natural right. It had become a controlled resource. Ironically, the freezing of lakes made such enforcement easier. Fishing spots were few. Ice paths could be tracked, and in some cases, local authorities marked sanctioned fishing holes with carved posts or religious symbols. Unauthorized holes were seen not only as theft, but as danger, since unmarked holes increased the risk of accidents for travelers and livestock. The tools get sharper. Technological development was slow in the Middle Ages, but ice fishing tools began to show regional refinements by the late 1200s. Iron chisels. These replaced stone and antler tools in many areas. Known as ispiker in parts of Scandinavia, they were made by local smiths and designed to be driven through the ice by mallets or by foot. Some had flattened heads, allowing a broader strike. Drag nets. In regions with deeper lakes, longer nets were developed. These were dragged beneath the ice using dual holes and weighted lines. This method required planning. Holes were often cut several meters apart and ropes threaded through using curved wooden under-ice runners. Tethered lures. Fishermen began to tie lures to long sticks, allowing them to move the bait gently from above the hole. This mimicked the motions of real fish and attracted curious predators like perch and pike. Ice scoops, a minor but meaningful innovation. After cutting a hole, slush and ice fragments needed to be removed repeatedly. Simple wooden scoops with holes to drain water were used, cheap, effective, and still recognizable today. Many of these tools were passed down through generations. In areas where smithing was inaccessible, entire villages shared a set of chisels, with schedules for their use. This quiet cooperation, rarely recorded in chronicles, was a vital part of winter survival. Monasteries and the faithful fishermen. One of the most detailed records of medieval ice fishing comes from the monastic orders. Unlike peasants, monks kept records, ledgers, schedules, and seasonal accounts. Monks were bound by both spiritual and physical hunger. The Benedictine rule, followed widely across Europe, mandated work as a form of prayer. Monasteries thus became centers of agricultural and fishing knowledge. In the frozen months, when field labor was minimal, many monks turned to fishing. In a manuscript from 1289 from the Abbey of Melk, Austria, there's a reference to the weekly duty of brothers Gottlieb and Alaric to maintain the ice holes near the lower pond. They were to ensure no snow should cover the surface, nor ice too thick grow without piercing. It was tedious work. Holes refroze quickly, fish moved with unpredictable patterns, and the cold was relentless. Yet monastic fishing was methodical. Fish were weighed, salted, and recorded. These records offer a rare glimpse into seasonal patterns. They show that catches declined in some years, likely due to overfishing or colder winters. This early data, though not scientific, hints at a growing awareness of environmental limits. Ice fishing beyond Europe. Though the focus of this story is Europe, it is worth noting that by the 13th century, knowledge of ice fishing extended beyond its original northern roots. In the east, Mongol expansion brought tales of frozen lakes in Siberia where local tribes used spears and traps under the ice. Though contact was limited, travelers occasionally brought this knowledge westward. Some scholars believe that ideas and practices moved slowly westward through trade routes. It's possible that Baltic fishermen adopted net designs or shelter concepts influenced by Uralic peoples further east. The interconnectedness of ice fishing communities, even across vast frozen distances, was subtle but real. Like the fish themselves, knowledge swam below the surface. Ice roads, ice markets. In colder regions, frozen lakes and rivers didn't just provide food, they became roads. Merchants used the frozen surfaces to move goods quickly between towns. In some areas, ice routes were maintained and marked. Fish caught through the ice were dried or kept in ice-backed containers and hauled across frozen rivers to larger towns. An example, in 14th century Novgorod, records show that winter fish deliveries increased by 40% compared to autumn ones. Ice, paradoxically, made transport easier. Frozen fish stayed preserved. Horses moved faster on flat surfaces. Even markets adapted. In places like Bergen and Riga, winter markets included frozen fish vendors with catch fresh from the ice. These markets were often informal, though some required permits or tithes. The quiet act of pulling fish from a hole in the ice had now become part of an economy. Ice fishing was no longer invisible. It fed towns, supplied monasteries, and paid taxes. Closing thoughts. As the 14th century approached, the cold grip of climate and commerce began to reshape everything once again. Trade grew, and with it, the need for standardized tools and measurements. Ice fishing, born in obscurity, had become a quiet but essential part of medieval life. But one question remains. What happened when nature no longer cooperated? When the fish disappeared, the ice thinned, or winters grew too harsh even for the most resilient fishermen? The Great Chill, when climate changed everything. You followed the trail of patience, invention, and necessity across centuries of frozen lakes and ancient tools. But now the story reaches a turning point. A slow, creeping shift begins, almost imperceptible at first. Fewer fish, longer winters, thicker ice, and then suddenly too much of what once sustained. Around the early 14th century, Northern Europe entered what climatologists later called the Little Ice Age. It wasn't a single event, but a prolonged period of cooler temperatures, with particularly brutal winters recorded between 1300 and 1450. For ice fishermen, those anonymous practitioners of subsistence in the cold, this climatic downturn brought paradoxes. The ice thickened, which should have helped, but it grew too thick. Holes became harder to drill. In some regions, lakes froze so deeply that reaching the water beneath became a half-day affair. Nets froze stiff. Lines snapped. Cold that once sustained now threatened life. More troubling, the fish began to vanish. A silent decline, the disappearance of fish. Why did fish stocks decline in so many northern regions during the 14th century? It wasn't only the cold. It was also overfishing, habitat disruption, and growing urban demands. Winter fishing, once practiced by scattered villages, was now common across entire provinces. Fish was no longer just a local staple, it had become a commodity. Monasteries, urban guilds, and noble estates increased their catch quotas. They relied on fish for religious fasts and economic exchange. Some even artificially stocked ponds and lakes, but in cold years, these ponds froze entirely, killing the stock. Meanwhile, ecosystems were changing. Colder weather shortened the breeding seasons of many fish species. Shallow lakes froze solid, killing eggs and juveniles. Rivers slowed. Wetlands shrank. Pike, perch, and roach, once dependable staples, became elusive. In regions like Pomerania and Prussia, communities recorded failed winters in which ice fishing yielded nothing at all. A chilling entry in the 1329 records of a monastery near Tartu, Estonia, reads, "The lake gave no food. The holes returned silence." Imagine walking a frozen lake, chiseling for hours, dropping a baited line into the deep and pulling nothing, then repeating it again the next day, and the next. Some fishermen starved, others migrated, a few adapted. Adaptation and innovation in the coldest century. Desperation, as it so often does, gave birth to new methods. By the mid-14th century, we begin to see more deliberate strategies for winter fishing. Ice corridors. In deeper lakes, fishermen learned to map the behavior of fish under ice. They cut lines of holes spaced a few meters apart, allowing them to drop weighted sounders and trace fish movements by trial and error. Fish weirs under ice. In some rivers and shallow lakes, small under-ice weirs were built with rocks and reeds. These acted as slow traps, allowing fish to swim in but not out. Unlike nets, these could be left for days at a time, reducing labor. Heated stones. To keep ice holes open longer, fishermen began dropping heated stones into freshly cut holes to delay refreezing. It bought them hours, sometimes enough to pull in a catch. Salt preservation at ice site. Instead of carrying fish back to settlements for curing, fishermen began bringing salt with them, preserving the catch on site in sled-mounted barrels. This innovation helped in years when fishing sites were farther from villages. Reclaimed hooks and line material. In times of shortage, every material mattered. Horsehair lines were boiled to reuse. Hooks, when broken, were reshaped and bound with sinew. Even bones from unsuccessful hunts were sharpened to replace metal. It's important to remember, these were not inventions documented in scholarly books. These were quiet changes passed down by word of mouth, born of desperation. But they worked. Shifting centers, who kept ice fishing alive. With declines in some regions, other areas rose to prominence in ice fishing, particularly northern Finland and Lapland. Sami communities remained remarkably resilient. Their intimate understanding of seasonal patterns, lake structures, and fish behavior allowed them to adapt. They built semi-permanent fishing huts on lakes, rotating between known productive areas. Novgorod and the Rus principalities. Despite climate hardship, these regions maintained strong under-ice fishing economies. Frozen rivers like the Volkhov served as both fishing sites and transport routes. Their success lay in centralized planning. In winter, boyar estates allocated ice fishing rights and coordinated distribution. Scotland and the Northern Isles. Ice fishing remained more limited here, but took on new importance in isolated island communities. Peat records and oral histories suggest that ice fishing supplemented meager winter diets in places like Orkney and Shetland. While Western Europe's fishing moved toward open waters and seafaring, Eastern and Northern Europe doubled down on the frozen lake. The shift was subtle, but by 1400, the cultural heart of medieval ice fishing had moved further north and east, closer to the Arctic edge. Cultural memory and vanishing names. One of the greatest ironies of medieval ice fishing is how little of it was ever written down, and how much was lost in the aftermath of plague, war, and social change. The Black Death, 1347–1351, decimated rural fishing populations. Many of the old men who knew where to cut holes or how to read the ice never passed down their knowledge. In some towns, fishing guilds collapsed. In others, the land was reallocated to more profitable uses. Yet fragments of memory remained. In remote villages, folklore absorbed the habits of winter fishing, tales of ice spirits stealing bait, songs describing black eyes on the lake, fishing holes, superstitions about never speaking while lowering your line. In some Slavic traditions, winter fishing became part of religious rituals. A hole was cut on Epiphany, symbolizing the baptism of Christ, and blessed water was drawn from the ice. The fishing that followed was both practical and sacred. By the late 15th century, medieval ice fishing as a widespread survival practice began to wane. Trade improved. Winters softened slightly. Populations recovered. But in the coldest corners of Europe, it never disappeared. The quiet legacy. What then is the legacy of medieval ice fishing? It is not monumental. There are no grand monuments, no saints canonized for their fishing prowess, no kingdoms built on ice holes. But the impact is real. Human resilience. These were people who, with tools carved from bone and stone, figured out how to live off a frozen lake, who returned year after year to the same black holes in the ice because they had no other choice. Unseen labor. Ice fishing fed monasteries, helped towns survive famine, and kept spiritual laws during religious fasts. Its importance far outpaced its visibility. Foundational knowledge. Techniques developed in the Middle Ages, under ice nets, decoys, insulated holes, laid groundwork for the eventual evolution of modern ice fishing. Today, recreational ice fishing may seem like a peaceful pastime, but its roots are far from leisurely. They were forged in hardship, silence, and endless cold. The next time you see a hole drilled in the ice, or a wooden shack parked on a frozen lake, consider the centuries that brought it there. Final reflection. As this first story draws to a close, one thought lingers. What other quiet technologies, born of struggle and nearly forgotten, still shape the way we live, even when we no longer remember their names? Story 2. The role of ice fishing in northern survival. A village encased in ice. Picture it, a settlement of no more than 24 households. Wooden huts with roofs blanketed in snow. Smoke rises lazily from peat-fired hearths. A small chapel stands with a frozen stream behind it. The trees are skeletal. The fields, once green with barley, are buried beneath a white crust. The year is 1312, and winter has arrived in what is now central Sweden. The villagers do not panic when the cold comes. They do not protest. This is expected. For 6 months the sun is low, the wind sharp, and the ground unyielding. They do what they've always done. They turn to the lake. What seems scenic now was once a grim fact of survival. These northern villages, whether in Sweden, Finland, Lithuania, or parts of northern Russia, existed only because they could draw sustenance from under the ice. Ice fishing was not merely a seasonal task. It was the economic and nutritional backbone of countless medieval communities. And unlike the nobility, who could buy salted fish or hunt game, peasants relied on the quiet persistence of pulling their next meal from the black hole in the ice. This is the story of how entire communities survived not by planting or plowing, but by fishing under frozen skis. Settlement patterns and proximity to water. Medieval northern Europe was a patchwork of isolated communities. Far from the centralized feudal estates of France or Germany, these villages were often semi-autonomous, built around lakes or river systems that provided both food and transit. Archaeological surveys in Finland's Tavastia region show a distinct pattern. Medieval dwellings clustered no more than 500 meters from a body of water, usually a lake or slow-moving river. These lakes were often shallow, which helped with under-ice netting and made drilling holes more manageable. Deeper lakes were reserved for summer fishing or avoided altogether. Some lakes were revered, others feared. Oral traditions in the Karelia region speak of deep lakes that hide spirits, which may reflect the real danger of unpredictable ice and drownings during winter fishing trips. But one truth was universal. No village could survive without reliable winter access to fish. A cold diet. What the ice provided. The ice didn't just offer food, it provided the food. Typical winter diets in these villages were shockingly narrow. With no fresh crops, little meat, and limited imports, people relied on the same few items. Smoked or salted pike, dried perch or roach, ice-preserved burbot, a prized winter catch, fermented fish, inland versions of surströmming-like preparations, flatbread baked and stored before winter, occasional stores of turnips, stored apples or berries. Protein came almost exclusively from fish between November and March. It was boiled, dried, fried in animal fat, or fermented. In some areas, thin fish broths were consumed daily, with bits of dried pike floating alongside crumbled bread. Importantly, fish was not just for eating. Fish bones were used in tools. Fish oil served as lamp fuel. Scales and skins were sometimes dried and repurposed for sewing or repairing waterproof clothing. And when fish ran out, hunger soon followed. Fishing as a community event. While modern notions of ice fishing evoke solitude, medieval ice fishing in villages was often a communal act. Fishing holes were carved early in the season, often in pairs or in long rows. Elders determined where to drill based on memory, tradition, and observation of early freeze patterns. It was known, for instance, that burbot hugged the lake bottom and preferred shaded spots. Pike lingered closer to reeds frozen in the shallows. When nets were used, teams of men, and sometimes women, dragged weighted nets under the ice between two holes. This required precision and coordination. In one Lithuanian folk tradition, a net song was sung to maintain rhythm during these hauls. Women and children often assisted by scooping slush from the holes to prevent refreezing, sorting fish by size and type, preparing smoke racks or salting troughs, recording yields for church tithe or community stores. In especially poor years, catch-sharing systems were enforced. The day's total would be divided proportionally among families. Such customs weren't always formalized, but in oral records collected in 19th century Lapland, old sayings like, "The line feeds the hand that helps," suggest long-standing cooperative traditions. The church and the frozen harvest. The church played a complex role in the life of the ice fishing village. On one hand, it demanded fish, as part of religious tithes and fasting obligations. Monks and parish priests expected a portion of the catch, particularly during Lent and other holy periods. Failure to deliver often led to fines or spiritual reprimands. But the church also helped organize and record fishing routines. Some parish churches maintained fishing calendars, indicating when and where certain lakes could be fished. These not only aligned with feast days but also functioned as environmental management. In the 14th century Codex of St. Olaus, Norway, a note beside Epiphany reads, "Here begins the ice of the second catch. Holes may be opened anew, and the net may pass, so long as the tide is right and the saints are named." This blend of mysticism, observation, and ritual allowed fishing knowledge to pass between generations, even if it was framed as divine wisdom rather than ecological insight. Dangers beneath the ice. Ice fishing was not without risks. Accidental deaths, though rarely recorded in formal chronicles, were a constant fear. Thin ice near river mouths or springs could give way without warning. In early season, fishermen might tie ropes around their waists, anchoring themselves to sleds or the shore. Hypothermia, too, was a silent killer. A fall into frigid water meant death in minutes. Thus, fishing was often done in pairs, not out of friendship but necessity. Another risk was overfishing. While early communities practiced moderation through tradition, increased demand from church and town markets created pressure to exceed sustainable yields. In some areas, lakes were rested every few years, closed to fishing for a season to allow recovery. But enforcement of such rules was inconsistent, And when hunger loomed, rules were forgotten. Lives woven with ice. It's easy to think of ice fishing as a task, a seasonal labor. But in medieval villages, it was much more, a part of identity. Children were taught to tie lines before they could read. Songs about fish migration and ice safety were passed down with the same reverence as prayers. Tools were made in the off-season and blessed at winter's first freeze. Entire marriage dowries in fishing villages included nets, line spools, or smoke racks. And perhaps most importantly, the ice taught patience. A man might wait hours beside a hole, listening to the wind and cracking frost. It was said that those who fished grew quiet in the soul, a phrase that appears in several 15th century Baltic homilies, always referring to ice fishermen. This spiritual calm wasn't romanticized. It was the byproduct of a life dictated by nature, of yielding to the frozen world, and surviving not through dominance but through quiet cooperation. Closing thoughts. As we leave this village, smoke drifting from chimneys, a child tugging on a frozen line, a mother laying fish on a rack beside a chapel, we're left with a lingering question. How did these fishing villages endure the mounting pressures of climate, authority, and growing outside markets in the centuries that followed? The pressure mounts, climate demands independence. The quiet resilience of medieval fishing villages was tested most severely in the 14th and 15th centuries, a period marked by intensifying winters, population shifts, rising religious obligations, and the slow grind of centralized control over local economies. These communities, which had once thrived in relative isolation, now found themselves more tightly bound to the outside world and more vulnerable to it. The Little Ice Age, which had begun to influence weather patterns by the late 13th century, fully gripped the north by 1350. Winters lasted longer and the growing seasons shortened. The need for winter sustenance increased. Fish, especially during fasting periods, became not just a preference but a lifeline. Yet as pressure from both environment and institution mounted, the systems that had held these villages together, custom, cooperation, ritual, began to strain. Monasteries, mandates, and the burden of piety. As we saw earlier, the church played a guiding role in ice fishing culture. But by the 14th century, this role shifted from that of a local spiritual anchor to that of a regulatory force, closely aligned with economic power structures. Parish records across northern Europe indicate a growing web of tithes and quotas. In Sweden, the church increased its claim from a tenth of the dried fish to the first catch of the Holy Week and the final catch of the season. These tithes were no longer symbolic gestures. They became mandatory, tracked in detailed ledgers, and enforced by local stewards. In Prussia and the Livonian Confederation, ecclesiastical institutions operated their own ice fishing crews, competing with peasant communities. In some cases, disputes arose over fishing rights on shared lakes. One 1392 court record from Reval, modern Tallinn, describes a conflict between a monastery and 3 fishing families, in which nets were seized by force and the families excommunicated for stealing from the Lord's waters. Religious holidays, now increasing in number and rigidity, dictated long stretches during which only fish could be consumed, adding further strain on already overfished lakes. This period marked a profound shift. Ice fishing was no longer a matter of the village alone. It had become part of a broader, more demanding religious economy. The social toll, hunger, inequality, and control. The increased value of winter fish gave rise to new forms of inequality. In earlier centuries, ice fishing was a collective, largely egalitarian task within a community. But by the late 1300s, distinctions emerged. Some families owned more nets or had better tools, allowing them to dominate early season catches. Village leaders or church-aligned households received first access to the most productive fishing holes. Wealthier households stored fish in underground pits, preserving food well into spring, while poorer families relied on daily catches. In famine years, of which there were several between 1315 and 1375, the inequalities turned fatal. Records from a village near Daugavpils in modern Latvia tell of a winter where the poorest villagers broke into monastery cellars to steal dried pike. The act was not simply a crime, it was labeled heresy. The punishment: exile and loss of fishing rights for the entire family. And yet, amid these cracks in the social fabric, the basic need for community never disappeared. In certain villages in northern Finland and Karelia, mutual aid systems were formalized during this period. Shared ice fishing shifts, resource pooling, and even seasonal fishing courts were created to resolve disputes without ecclesiastical involvement. These weren't utopias, but they were attempts to hold on to older forms of survival under increasing pressure. Ice as infrastructure, sled paths, trade, and the frozen highway. While the hardships of winter are well documented, what's often overlooked is how ice created infrastructure in the medieval North. Frozen lakes and rivers were transformed into seasonal roads, connecting isolated communities in ways impassable during spring and autumn. Horses, sleds, and even carts loaded with dried fish used these routes to reach towns and abbeys. A preserved 15th century ledger from Turku in modern Finland lists over 40 sled deliveries of winter fish from rural parishes between January and March alone. These weren't small deliveries. They ranged from 50 to 200 dried fish per load, mostly burbot and pike. As a result, certain villages became ice hubs. Located at crossroads of frozen rivers or lake junctions, they hosted transient merchants, ecclesiastical buyers, and tax collectors. Local fishing economies began to revolve around winter sale opportunities. Yet this brought a new problem. Fish became a commodity, not just sustenance. Fishermen now faced decisions: feed the village, pay the tithe, or sell to traders. The tension between economic survival and communal obligation strained relationships and altered fishing schedules. More fish were caught, but fewer made it to local mouths. Some villages responded by establishing fishing rotation rules, allocating certain days for local use, others for trade, and enforcing net limits. These codes were rarely written, but stories of their enforcement persist in oral traditions, passed down into the 19th century. Innovations and responses to strain. Technological response during this period was modest, but notable. Improved ice saws. Replacing chisels for large operations, these two-man saws allowed wider holes for better net placement. Under ice marking stakes. Fishermen began leaving carved wooden stakes at known fishing holes, both to prevent accidents and mark territory. Fish holders in ice caves. In mountainous areas, some villages carved out shallow ice caves near lakes to store fish outside, safe from predators and spoilage. While these may seem minor, they reflect a constant thread: adaptation born from limitation. Culturally, this period also produced songs and superstitions tied directly to under-ice fishing. In Estonia, a winter lullaby speaks of the hole that hums and the line that sings, likely referencing the sound of wind over ice holes. Fishermen in Karelia left offerings, usually bread crusts, at the first hole of the season, so the fish would know you remembered their hunger too. Superstition and survival blurred. Faith, luck, and experience were seen as equal tools of the trade. When fishing failed, the edge of collapse. Despite all innovation and resolve, some winters broke even the strongest villages. The winters of 1434–1436 were especially severe across the Baltic interior. Chroniclers noted entire lakes frozen solid to the bottom, killing every fish in them. In one monastery record from Pskov, a scribe writes, "The fish have gone below the ice and into the stone. We dig and find only silence. Famine followed. In some areas, ice fishing was abandoned entirely for 2 or more seasons. People turned to trapping animals, cutting bark to eat, or leaving their villages behind. Some never returned. These collapses were rarely documented in grand chronicles. They left no cathedrals or wars, only frozen holes, sunken nets, and half-remembered prayers. Yet even after these darkest winters, some villages endured, not by mastering the ice, but by listening to it, learning its moods, changing with its patterns, and surviving not as heroes, but as caretakers of quiet knowledge. Closing thoughts. As the late Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, the fishing village began to change. Towns grew, trade centralized. The quiet winters remained, but the people and their way of life slowly shifted with the currents of history. Still, we must ask, how did these traditions, born of struggle and silence, echo into the early modern world? And can we trace their legacy in the fishing practices that followed? The thawing edge of tradition. By the early 16th century, the landscape of the medieval world had begun to shift, politically, economically, and climatically. And though the ice still blanketed the lakes of the north each winter, the world around those lakes was changing. The frozen villages of the Middle Ages, those humble hamlets tucked against lakes and rivers, did not vanish overnight. Rather, they evolved slowly, subtly, and sometimes unknowingly, carrying their winter fishing traditions into a new age shaped by centralizing monarchies, expanding trade routes, and the slow trickle of Renaissance thought. What had once been simple survival began to acquire new meaning. Ice fishing moved from a matter of life and death to one part of a complex rural economy. And though the old songs, rituals, and tools began to fade, their quiet legacy lived on. This is the story of how the culture of ice-bound fishing villages transformed, not in a blaze of change, but in the hush of continuity. New laws for old waters. As the modern state began to emerge in Scandinavia, the Baltic, and parts of Eastern Europe, so too did new systems of governance over rural life, including water rights. In Sweden, the Gustavian land reforms, beginning in the late 1500s, attempted to standardize land and resource ownership, including lakes and rivers. For many villages, this meant that communal fishing zones, long governed by oral custom and seasonal use, were now formally measured, recorded, and taxed. A small village in Hälsingland might now be told which portion of the lake was theirs, how many nets they could legally cast, and how much of their catch needed to be tithed or sold. In some regions, ice fishing permits became necessary, formalized through local officials or parish records. This process was slow. In isolated areas, traditional customs persisted long after reforms were written into law, but the direction was clear. Ice fishing was no longer merely a matter of tradition. It was becoming a regulated resource. Still, the practice survived, adapted, resisted, or redefined depending on the village. From survival to trade, a village economy on ice. With the rise of organized trade networks in the 16th century, many formerly isolated fishing villages found themselves drawn into a broader economic web. Winter fish, especially preserved pike, perch, and burbot, became valuable commodities. Merchants from Stockholm, Riga, or even Lübeck made seasonal trips into the interior to purchase dried or salted fish in bulk. This created new incentives and new pressures. Villagers who once fished only to feed their families now had a choice. Sell their catch for coin, often at inflated prices, or continue dividing fish among neighbors, following age-old customs. Many did both. The result was the slow emergence of dual economies, one based on tradition, the other on trade. In eastern Finland, for example, it became common for villages to designate certain nets for the market catch, while others were used only for local use. Some families specialized, Those with access to better tools or lake spots fished for trade, while others worked to supply village needs. Over time, a few individuals grew relatively wealthy. A 1587 tax ledger from Tavastia lists 3 households with unusually high inventories of dried fish and nets, likely those who had turned their frozen labor into profit. But with profit came disparity. Some elders lamented the loss of sharing customs, once essential during lean winters. The phrase "ice without kindness" begins to appear in Finnish folktales around this time, referring to the new generation of fishermen who fished only for coin, not kin. The evolution of tools and techniques. By 1600, ice fishing tools had advanced, though the fundamentals remained recognizable. Two-man ice saws had replaced hand chisels for larger operations. These allowed wide holes for under-ice nets. Auger-like drills made their appearance in some western regions, easing the burden of solo fishing. Portable wooden shelters, lightly insulated with wool or bark, became more common, especially among traders or wealthier families. These were precursors to the modern ice shanty. Braided flax lines replaced horsehair in some areas, offering greater strength and flexibility. In Livonia and Prussia, some fishing villages used under-ice fencing, creating makeshift channels under the ice to trap fish in certain areas. Though labor-intensive, this method allowed for more passive fishing during peak winter, freeing labor for other work. These tools, once passed down orally or handcrafted locally, now appeared in inventories, trade manifests, and even illustrated manuals. Rare, but emerging by the late 16th century in urban centers. Fishing was becoming technical, and with that shift came a separation between those who could afford new tools and those who could not. Ritual, memory, and the fatting of the old ways. Even as the practical face of winter fishing evolved, its spiritual and cultural roots lingered, though they too began to change. Many villages still opened their ice fishing season with a blessing. In Sweden, a local priest might sprinkle salt on the ice and say a short prayer for safety and yield. In Eastern Orthodox regions, the Epiphany whole ritual became deeply entwined with the act of under-ice fishing, combining sacred water gathering with the practical beginnings of the winter harvest. Songs were still sung, though fewer of them. Children were still taught to tie knots, red ice cracks, and carry slush buckets, but there was a sense of nostalgia within the practice, even among those who continued it. One 1612 letter from a Lutheran pastor in Savonia laments, "The boys know the lake's edge but not her voice. They cast lines, but forget the names of holes their fathers called holy." As Europe entered the modern era, oral traditions began to wither, erased by new languages of science, trade, and reform. Still, fragments survived. In the Finnish Karelian borderlands, families continued using ancestral ice holes named after long-deceased fishermen. In parts of Latvia, the first fish caught in January was still given to the oldest woman in the village, a token of respect, not utility. The culture of the ice persisted, not always visible but felt. Legacy: how ice fishing endured into the modern world. Though few today think of medieval villagers when they see modern ice fishermen on frozen lakes, the connection is real. The practice endured through centuries, evolving from survival into culture and eventually into sport. Yet the roots of even the most modern setups, heated tents, sonar fish finders, and carbon fiber rods, stretch back to the bone hooks, bark lines, and snow-sheltered patience of those long-ago winters. Many modern fishing families in the Nordic countries, Baltic states, and northern Russia can trace their methods, and even their favorite lake spots, back hundreds of years. Oral memory has become anecdote. Custom has become preference, but the lake remains the same. And so does the ice. Candle final reflection. In every cold gust across a frozen lake, in every small hole cut into thick white silence, a quiet memory lingers. It is the story of a people who did not conquer winter, but outlasted it, who bent their lives to nature's rhythm, and in doing so, carved out survival with lines and nets and smoke and hope. And we're left with a final thought. How many other humble acts of endurance have shaped history, not in palaces or on battlefields, but in frozen villages, around black holes in the ice, with no audience but the wind. Story 3. Tools of the Trade in the Baltic States. Introduction: a toolkit in the cold. As the ice hardens underfoot, you kneel beside a small, smoke-darkened hole. A thin gust of wind sweeps across the lake, tugging at your wool cloak. You reach for your line horsehair, coiled on a carved wooden reel, and peer down into the black water. It's quiet, still, and cold. You're alone, but not unique. This scene could be set in Latvia, Estonia, or Lithuania during the 13th century. What connects them all is a simple truth. A fisherman's survival depended not only on skill but on tools. Tools he often made himself, modified seasonally, and guarded with quiet pride. In this story, we'll explore the humble but ingenious equipment used by ice fishermen across the Baltic states in the Middle Ages. Bone hooks, birch bark floats, knotted gut lines, and carved net weights. Each item was crafted with intention, refined through trial and error, and quietly passed down through generations. These were not weapons of war nor treasures of court, but they shaped lives just the same. Today, few of these tools remain, lost to rot, ice, or indifference. But the fragments that do survive tell a story of adaptation, local ingenuity, and how the simplest objects can carry the weight of centuries. The Baltic context: ice, lakes, and labor. The Baltic states, modern-day Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were deeply shaped by their waterways. Thousands of lakes, frozen rivers, and coastal inlets provided fish year-round, but particularly in winter, when terrestrial food grew scarce. Unlike their Scandinavian neighbors, the Baltic peoples often operated in smaller, semi-nomadic communities. In the early and high Middle Ages, tribal structures such as the Curonians, Semigalians, and Estonians relied heavily on seasonal fishing patterns. Winter, with its blanket of ice, was not seen as a dead season, but as a time of abundance. Fishermen would often travel short distances from their forest homes to winter camps beside known fishing lakes. These camps were primitive, little more than shelters of bark and straw, but they were stocked with carefully stored tools. Each item had its place. Each tool had a story. Hooks of bone, copper, and iron. Perhaps the most iconic of early ice fishing tools was the bone hook, carved from deer antler, boar tusk, or even human bone in rare cases. These hooks were not barbed like modern ones. Instead, they used a toggle mechanism. The hook would enter the fish's mouth and then rotate when pulled, catching in the throat. This required more precise tension from the fisherman, but was surprisingly effective. By the 12th century, metal hooks began to appear in wealthier communities, crafted from soft copper or wrought iron. These were often hand-forged, then quenched in oil or cold water to temper the metal. In some villages, hooks were blessed by local priests at the start of winter, a small gesture of protection and good fortune. Hook sizes varied depending on the target fish. Small bone hooks for perch or roach. Large iron toggles for burbot or pike. Triple hook clusters, early treble hook styles for net use, though these were rare. Hooks were kept in cloth bundles or leather pouches, often lined with straw to prevent rust or freezing. Some fishermen carried small sharpening stones to hone the tips between catches. Lines and lures, gut hair and bark. The lines used in Baltic winter fishing were a marvel of resourcefulness. Horsehair was most common, braided into coarse but strong cords. A single line might contain hairs from dozens of horses, carefully twisted and soaked in warm water before use. Horsehair had the advantage of being resilient in freezing water, though it could stiffen and crack if improperly stored. Other materials included linen thread, in areas with textile production. Boiled animal sinew, used by inland forest tribes. Bast fibers from linden or elm bark, twisted into rough cord for net lines. To keep lines visible and prevent tangling under the ice, fishermen attached small floats. These were carved from birch bark or corkwood, sometimes decorated with carved sigils to ward off ill luck. One rare example, excavated near Lake Papus, featured a tiny wolf etched into its surface, likely a tribal totem or family mark. Lures were rudimentary but effective. The most common type was a spoon lure, a bit of flattened bone or metal shaped like a small fish. These were tied to the end of the line and jiggled manually. In darker waters, some fishermen rubbed the lure with fish oil or rotting bait to increase its scent. Cutting the ice, tools of access. Before the fish could be caught, the ice had to be conquered. In the early medieval Baltic, the primary tool for ice cutting was a long iron chisel, sometimes called an augers in Old Latvian. This chisel was driven into the ice with a wooden mallet or swung in a repeated stabbing motion. The resulting hole was usually circular or oval, 10-20 cm wide for single-line fishing, rectangular up to 1 meter wide for net deployments. The edges of the hole were lined with pine branches or straw to prevent refreezing too quickly. In very cold conditions, fishermen kept a small ceramic oil lamp or heated stone nearby, placing it next to the hole to delay icing. Some villages maintained shared hole-cutting equipment, stored communally and sharpened weekly. A local elder or tool keeper was responsible for ensuring the chisel was true, a term that meant sharp, even, and spiritually clean. In Estonia's inland lakes, a rare tool known as the ice auger emerged by the 14th century, a crude spiral drill with a wooden handle and an iron blade. These were prized possessions, sometimes passed down for generations and inscribed with the family's mark. Nets, weights, and under-ice traps. Net fishing beneath the ice was a larger operation, often requiring groups of 3 or more. The nets themselves were made from bast fibers or coarse linen, knotted with wooden mesh gauges to maintain even spacing. Mesh size was carefully chosen depending on target species and local regulation, when applicable. To deploy the net under the ice, fishermen used a long guide pole up to 3 meters, a curved line runner, a hooked branch or specially carved fishing sled designed to thread the net beneath the ice. Lead or stone weights, tied to the bottom of the net, often marked with small carved symbols to identify the owner. These nets were dragged between 2 holes, one for entry, one for retrieval. It was tedious work, requiring constant alignment and communication. Some fishermen employed static traps, especially in shallow lakes. These were made from woven reeds or bark strips, shaped into funnel-like cones and baited with fermented fish or blood. Once set, they were left beneath the ice for days. Such traps were favored by the elderly or infirm, who could not cut ice daily. Storage, maintenance, and repair. Winter tools were fragile, and exposure to moisture, salt, or blunt force could ruin a season's worth of preparation. Most fishermen in the Baltic kept a wooden tool chest, wrapped in animal hide and stored near the hearth. This chest included hooks bundled by type, spools of dried line, carving knives, small grindstones, beeswax for waterproofing, a clay pot of fish oil for baiting and seasoning tools. During the off-season, tools were soaked, dried, and rewaxed. Children were often taught basic repair work, how to retie broken net knots, patch a cracked float, or straighten a bent hook. In some villages, a tool, an elder or retired fisherman, would inspect everyone's kit at the start of winter, offering advice or quietly shamming those who had neglected their craft. Tool care was more than practical, it was cultural. A fisherman who failed to maintain his tools was seen as ungrateful to the lake. Closing thoughts. As we close the lid on the chest of tools beneath the frost, a question lingers. How did the mastery of these tools, once local, handmade, and personal, change as foreign trade, religious orders, and centralized states brought new equipment, materials, and expectations into the Baltic world? A shift in the ice, new influences on ancient tools. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Baltic states were no longer isolated tribal lands governed by forest traditions and riverside rituals. They were now part of a growing web of political alliances, crusader incursions, trade networks, and Christian conversion. This slow but steady shift brought outside influence to even the smallest fishing village, and nowhere was this more subtly visible than in the tools used to survive the winter. The quiet craftsman who once carved hooks from bone now found himself encountering iron-forging merchants from the Hanseatic League. The basket weaver who wove bark floats heard of imported waxed cords from Lubeck. Church orders, military expeditions, and the ambitions of local nobles all reached into the heart of winter fishing, not through direct control, but through new expectations. Tools changed, some improved, others were replaced, but something more profound happened. The meaning of the tools began to shift from symbols of subsistence to instruments of production. Metalwork arrives, iron hooks, bronze lures, and imported blades. The increasing trade through Hanseatic ports like Riga, Reval, Tallinn, and Klaipėda introduced new materials into the Baltic countryside. Traders brought wrought iron, bronze fragments, and even the occasional file or chisel manufactured in German towns. These materials transformed local craftsmanship. Hooks, once painstakingly carved from bone, could now be forged more quickly and in larger numbers. Small village forges, previously used for making nails or horseshoes, began to produce specialized fishing hardware during the winter months. The process remained manual and primitive by modern standards, but the effect was significant. By the mid-14th century, inventories from a manor near Viljandi in Estonia listed 64 iron fishing hooks for winter and summer use, 3 bronze flicker lures, 2 iron ice chisels, 1 merchant's net, thought to be an imported model of finer gauge linen mesh. The bronze lures were especially coveted. Unlike homemade bone decoys, these were thin, hammered into curved shapes, and sometimes engraved with simple lines meant to imitate fish scales. They reflected light more effectively under the ice, a novelty that gave them both symbolic and practical value. One priest even referred to them as God's mirror for fish. Centralization and the emergence of standardized tools. As Christianity and feudal authority tightened their grip over the region, the organization of rural labor followed suit. With it came a move toward standardization, even in something as niche as ice fishing. By the late 1300s, some manor lords issued fishing kits to their serfs. These were basic, 1 chisel, 1 set of lines, a small net, but marked with the estate's crest or initials. The implication was clear. The tools belonged to the manor and so did the fish. This marked a break from the older, more communal traditions of tool-making. Where once tools were private, often imbued with meaning and passed from father to son, they were now objects of authority, counted, tracked, and sometimes taxed. For villagers, this could be demoralizing. In a letter from 1398 found near Panevėžys in present-day Lithuania, a fisherman writes, "I held the chisel and it had no name. It cut, but it did not know me." A simple sentiment, yet one that reveals a growing disconnect between the tool and the person who used it. A symbolic fracture in a world once ruled by intimate, handmade labor. Trade materials and the rise of professional gear. Trade also introduced new materials for lines and nets. Chief among them were imported linen, which had higher tensile strength and lasted longer in wet conditions than bast fibers. Waxed hemp cord, used in net making and line crafting. Small brass fittings, allowing faster tying and retying of lines in the cold. These materials were often prohibitively expensive for poor families, but wealthier households, or those under contract to deliver fish to towns or churches, began to adopt them. This, in turn, began to separate the everyday ice fisher from the professional supplier. In Reval, court records from 1421 mention a dispute between two fishing crews, one using traditional bark cord nets and the other using waxed imported lines. The former accused the latter of fouling the water by catching beyond their share, but the court sided with the modern crew, praising their efficiency and delivery record to local clergy. What had once been a shared practice of survival was turning into a competitive trade, defined by access to better tools and better contacts. Tool ownership and identity. Despite these changes, in smaller, more remote villages, the old relationships between fishermen and tool persisted. Tools were named, even as newer materials arrived. A fisherman might call his chisel Zhachek Varus, the beast, or his favored hook Tylenes, the silent one. Families still marked their gear with runes, etchings, or notches, often keeping them bundled in woven bark satchels that dated back generations. Children learned tool maintenance as a rite of passage. Grandparents taught them not just how to fish, but how to respect the gear, to understand it as part of nature's rhythm, not just a means to extract from it. In Estonian lake regions, fishermen were known to speak to their tools before the season began. One tradition involved a fisherman placing his gear outside for the first snowfall, whispering, "Now you have seen the sky, tomorrow you meet the lake." Ecclesiastical tools, sacred gear, and monastic innovation. Within monastic communities, particularly the Cistercians and Benedictines, ice fishing tools took on an almost liturgical function. Monks used standardized sets of gear, often stored in specially designated rooms within the monastery, known in some orders as aqua armarium or water armory. These tools were simple but well-maintained, crafted with precision and preserved with beeswax and parchment wrappings. Monastic records from an abbey near Tartu list 12 winter nets, each tagged with a wooden marker engraved with the initials SB, Sanctus Petrus. 3 iron ice chisels wrapped in lambskin. 20 approved lines, twisted under supervision of the cellarer. The use of sacred markings on nets and floats was common. Crosses, fish symbols, ichthyes, or even saints' initials were carved into floats. Some monks claimed that prayers spoken over the hole improved yields, and ice holes were occasionally blessed before being cut. This blend of spiritual purpose and practical gear created a distinct subculture of winter fishing tools, designed not only for use but for devotion. Gear for trade, storage, transport, and security. As fish became a trade good rather than just food, so too did the tools of winter fishing reflect concerns of storage, transport, and theft. Fishermen adapted by building locking tool chests with iron hinges, using sleds with hidden compartments to carry fish and gear across lakes, fashioning ice coffers, shallow boxes sunk into the snow to keep tools cold but dry. In larger fishing operations, it became common to inscribe tools with a tally system. Every time the tool was used, a notch was added. This allowed some monasteries and manors to track usage and justify repairs or replacement. But it also meant that the tool was no longer personal. It was a number in a ledger. This small change, more than any other, marked the passing of an era. Candle closing thoughts. As we look over this evolving collection of gear, some handmade, some imported, some blessed, some taxed, we begin to see the story not only of a craft but of a people. Tools are often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, but here, beneath the frost, we see how every hook, chisel, float, and net tells a tale of human adaptability, of change, not sudden but slow and constant. Still, we must ask, how did these Baltic fishing tools fare in the coming age of war, reform, and growing state power? And what parts of this ancient toolkit still echo today? Enter the fire, war, reformation, and the erosion of custom. As the 15th century faded into the 16th, the Baltic world entered a storm of upheaval. The region, long a quiet corner of Europe, became a battleground. The Livonian Wars, the spread of the Protestant Reformation, and the growing power of centralized monarchies unraveled the fabric of everyday life across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Peasant revolts, conscription, and territorial disputes destabilized communities that had quietly relied on the lake and the ice for centuries. These were not just events in the chronicles. They were blades that cut directly through the traditions of winter fishing. Villages were burned. Lakes were claimed by feudal lords or seized in war. Monasteries were looted or dissolved. In many regions, the tools of the trade were not passed down but left behind, broken, buried in snowdrifts, or repurposed for war. A bone hook could become a trap barb. A fishing spear might be reforged into a weapon. The soft winter prayers spoken over ice holes were replaced with the march of boots and the crack of gunpowder. In this final section, we trace how these tools, once so vital, disappeared, some literally, others culturally, and what fragments remain today. The dissolution of the monasteries and sacred gear. One of the most dramatic shifts in the Baltic tool tradition came with the Protestant Reformation. As Lutheranism spread through the region, supported by local princes and foreign powers, monasteries were seized or closed. Their contents were looted or repurposed. The aqua armaria, or water tool chests that once housed blessed hooks and waxed nets, were often destroyed or burned. An account from a 1562 Protestant reformer in Reval records. The monks fled, leaving their iron nets and Catholic charms. We cast them into the fire, that such foolish tools might no longer steal God's glory. Where once fishing tools were bound up with devotion, now they were labeled superstitious or idolatrous. The prayers carved into floats, the tiny wooden crucifixes tied to net weights, the hooks shaped like fish and saints, they were lost. Some monks fled into rural communities, preserving pieces of the craft. Others gave up fishing altogether. A few of their tools survive today in church vaults or museum drawers, mute, rusted relics of a forgotten piety. Tools of peace become tools of war. War transforms everything, especially tools. During the Livonian War, 1558–1583, armies swept across the region. Forests were cut for timber. Villages were razed. In desperate times, fishing gear was repurposed. Ice chisels became spearheads or farming tools. Hooks were straightened into needles or made into crude arrowheads. Nets were used to trap or ensnare, not fish, but enemies or game. Sleds built for fish transport became stretchers or supply carriers. One of the few surviving inventories from this period, recorded in 1574 in Daugavpils, lists 15 lines, 6 chisel points, 3 hooks rusted, unusable, found in the collapsed hut by the lake. These were not items of use, but the detritus of a collapsed way of life. Families displaced by war often abandoned their fishing traditions. Children grew up without learning how to tie lines or cut ice safely. The knowledge that once passed hand to hand was severed. And yet in the coldest corners, it did not fully vanish. Preservation through isolation. Paradoxically, the most enduring ice fishing traditions survived not in cities or centers of power, but in the isolated hinterlands, places too remote or poor to attract armies, reformers, or tax collectors. In inland Latvia and the forests of eastern Estonia, a quiet form of cultural resistance took place. Families continued using traditional gear, carving floats from birch bark, weaving lines from bast fibers, and storing their tools in oiled bark boxes passed down from elder to child. In some areas, Catholic rituals and tool blessings survived well into the 17th century, hidden from Lutheran authorities. A local fisherman might whisper a prayer over his chisel before the first cut of the year. A carved hook in the shape of a cross might be hidden inside a pouch, protected more by sentiment than dogma. These hidden practices were never written down, but echoes remain in oral histories and folklore. For example, in a small village near Lake Vortsiev, Estonia, a 19th-century collector recorded a tale of the old hook, a curved bone charm said to ensure fish in cold winters. Though no such hook survives, its legend hints at the long memory of tools in the culture's subconscious. Archaeology and the rediscovery of forgotten tools. It wasn't until the 20th century that serious archaeological interest emerged in medieval fishing tools of the Baltic. What researchers found confirmed much of what had only been hinted at in texts and oral traditions. In lake beds, collapsed huts, and riverside middens, they uncovered bone hooks, some etched with markings or adorned with copper wire. Wooden floats, burned or waterlogged but intact. Stone net weights, carved with identifying marks. Fragments of linen and bass nets, preserved in anaerobic mud. Iron chisels, worn smooth from use, sometimes sharpened unevenly by their final owners. These findings prove that the tools of medieval ice fishing were not only widespread but incredibly diverse, regional, customized, and full of symbolic detail. In modern ethnographic museums in Tartu, Vilnius, and Riga, many of these items are displayed without fanfare. Visitors might glance at them, a rusted chisel, a loop of horsehair, and move on. But these humble tools were once lifelines, held in frostbitten hands, trusted more than the words of kings or preachers. The cultural echo, what remains today. Modern ice fishing in the Baltic region, while now often recreational, still bears traces of the medieval past. In rural Estonia, some families still use wooden tip-ups that echo the toggle mechanisms of bone hooks. In parts of Latvia, older fishermen still teach their grandchildren to cut rectangular holes, as their ancestors did for net use. In northern Lithuania, it's not uncommon to hear songs or chants while fishing, nonsensical to outsiders but said to keep the fish listening. Local festivals sometimes feature ceremonial first hole cuts, a distant echo of monastic blessings. These are not conscious recreations. They are cultural residue, faint fingerprints of a world preserved in memory, not monuments. Candle final reflection. What is the worth of a hook carved from bone, a float made of bark, a net tied by hand in the quiet of a snow-covered hut? To history's grand narrative, perhaps very little. These tools do not speak of kings, revolutions, or treaties, but they speak of something more elemental, a people's endurance, their craftsmanship, and their relationship with a world that offered no comfort without effort. They remind us that survival is not always loud, that the most significant technologies are often the quietest, that the line between extinction and tradition can be as thin as a horsehair fishing line. And so, beneath the frost, these tools rest, not discarded but waiting, for the lake to freeze again, for the stories to be told, for the next hand to reach for the chisel and make the first cut. Story 4. Ice Holes and Empire. Fishing Practices in Kievan Rus. Introduction. Empire on Ice. The Kievan Rus was not a frozen kingdom of storybooks. It was a complex federation of Slavic, Norse, and Finno-Ugric peoples stretching from the cold forests of the north to the golden domes of Kiev. Born of Viking ambition and local resilience, this early medieval polity thrived not on conquest alone but on waterways, frozen and flowing. In the south, the Dnieper flowed freely, but in the north and east, rivers froze, lakes sealed beneath thick ice, and villages turned to the ice not as a barrier but as an avenue of survival. In these frigid months, ice fishing wasn't a curiosity. It was a matter of imperial stability. As grain shipments slowed and roads became impassable, winter fish fed peasants, monasteries, traders, and soldiers alike. It kept commerce alive. It fulfilled religious fasts, and in many cases it prevented hunger from becoming revolt. This is the story of how ice fishing operated within the structure of Kievan Ruse, not just as a rural craft, but as a quiet, often overlooked pillar of the state. Geography and climate, why ice fishing mattered. To understand ice fishing in Kievan Ruse, one must first understand the land itself. From the 10th to 13th centuries, the Rus controlled territories spanning modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, and parts of the Baltics. Winters in the northern and central zones were long, predictable, and brutal. Snow could arrive as early as October. Rivers like the Volkhov, the Oka, and the Upper Dnieper froze for months at a time. In these regions, farming ceased in winter. Hunting became difficult. Roads turned to icy corridors, yet fish still swam under the ice. And unlike other forms of food production, fishing scaled easily. A skilled group of workers could feed an entire village, monastery, or garrison, provided they had the right tools and knowledge. Kievan Ruse took full advantage of this. The state's bureaucrats, religious leaders, and princes all came to depend on winter fish, not only for survival but for trade and diplomacy. Legal records and fishing rights in the Ruse, law code. One of the most compelling insights into ice fishing under Kievan Ruse comes from the Russkaya Pravda, the 11th century legal code compiled under Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Though the code does not explicitly mention ice fishing, it devotes several entries to fisheries, water rights, and the theft of fishing equipment. These entries suggest that winter fishing was regulated, valuable, and occasionally contested. For example, damage or theft of nets could be fined as heavily as the theft of a plow. Fishing in someone else's river section without permission resulted in fines or corporal punishment. Monasteries were granted exclusive rights to certain lakes, often near winter quarters. One case from the 12th century, preserved in a monastic chronicle near Novgorod, describes a dispute over ice holes. The brothers of St. Elijah laid claim to the 3 black holes of the east shore, but peasants from the village of Birovo came in darkness and took fish from beneath the crosses. The matter was brought before the voivode, who ruled in favor of the monks. The peasants paid with 3 barrels of smoked perch. This shows that ice fishing holes could be marked, claimed, and defended, often with legal or religious backing. Winter fishing settlements and the role of the monastery. Monasteries played a central role in organizing ice fishing in the north of Ruse. From Novgorod to Rostov, monastic orders were not merely religious centers. They were economic hubs, operating granaries, smokehouses, and fish storage facilities. During winter, they became centers of systematized ice fishing. Records from the Antoniv Monastery near Novgorod show ice holes opened in mid-December, marked with wooden crosses. Crews of lay brothers and hired peasant assigned to rotating shifts. Fish brought back daily, weighed and recorded. A portion salted and sent to Kiev or other principalities as tithe or trade. Fishing gear was stored in dedicated sheds. Nets were repaired during spring. Horses were used to haul ice blocks and sleds full of fish. In some cases, monks paid local families in salted cod or burbot in exchange for winter labor. A particularly revealing account from 1187 describes an abbey on Lake Ilmen. The Lord blessed our labors with 40 pike and 27 perch this week. Brothers Alexei and Timofei kept the holes clear of snow and the nets well set. The fish shall be split among the table, the tithe, and the poor. Here, ice fishing was ritualized, recorded, and vital, feeding not just the body, but the spiritual and social obligations of the monastery. Military garrisons and winter fishing. The Rus maintained small military garrisons in strategic northern towns, places like Ladoga, Belozersk, and Pskov. These were far from supply lines and often snowbound in winter. Winter fish was key to their survival. Commanders often employed local fishermen or assigned soldiers to fishing duty during colder months. Ice holes were dug in defensive positions, sometimes even within the walls of small forts when they were built near rivers or lakes. Supply records from Pskov, circa 1210, detail rations of dried perch and salted burbot for soldiers, fishing gear purchased with state funds, fish deliveries made across frozen river using sled patrols. In times of siege or isolation, winter fish meant the difference between holding and collapsing. It provided critical protein, preserved easily, and could be prepared with minimal firewood. Even royal envoys, traveling frozen roads in winter, often carried smoked fish packed in hay-lined boxes, an early form of ration kits for diplomats and messengers. Tools of the ruse ice fishermen. Though fewer physical examples survive compared to Scandinavia or the Baltics, descriptions in chronicles and travel accounts offer clues to the tools used. Most common were iron chisels and ice saws, often passed down in military and religious institutions. Bass fiber nets, occasionally waxed for durability. Hooks fashioned from copper or deer antler, tied with horsehair line. Birch bark floats, sometimes painted with simple designs. Snowshoes and sled, designed for carrying fish over frozen terrain. In Novgorod's merchant records, there is even mention of ice fishing kits, complete sets of gear, likely purchased by nobles or sold to trade crews heading into rural areas. Some tools were ceremonially blessed at the start of winter. Others were buried with their owners. One grave uncovered near Belozersk revealed a man buried with his ice chisel, a bundle of hooks, and a tiny carved float, testament to the deep identity tied to winter fishing. Ice fishing as tax and tribute. One little-known aspect of ruse administration was its use of fish as tax, especially in winter. Peasants were often required to deliver measured quantities of fish to local lords or ecclesiastical authorities. These deliveries were expected to be preserved, dried, smoked, or salted, and were logged in tax rolls. In some cases, frozen fish itself served as currency, used to pay for hay, iron tools, or permission to cut wood from noble forests. One charter from the 13th century, granting fishing rights to a small village, specifies, "They may cast lines upon the lake of the Heron and take from it what is fair, but each household shall give 5 pike to the boyar's table each year, before the first melt." Thus, ice fishing became not just survival or trade, it became bureaucratic obligation, tangled in a growing system of feudal control. Candle closing thoughts. As you picture the great white lakes of the Ruse, dotted with small black holes and men wrapped in fur, you begin to see that ice fishing was never merely rural toil. It was a vital artery in the great body of a rising empire. And yet we must wonder, what happened to these systems when Kievan Rus fractured, when Mongol rule descended, and the north was reshaped by new powers, new orders, and new ways of surviving the cold? The Mongol invasion, upending the old order. In 1237, the Mongols arrived at the doorstep of the Rus. The impact was sudden, brutal, and widespread. Cities burned, principalities collapsed, trade routes were disrupted. Political authority shifted from the princely courts of Kiev and Vladimir to the distant khans of the Golden Horde, who ruled indirectly through tribute and fear. Yet, amid all this devastation and change, something curious happened. Life in the frozen north continued, and so did the ice fishing. Why? Because ice fishing, like the rivers and lakes it depended on, ran beneath the surface of empire. It was quiet, local, adaptable. It required no kings to approve it, no silver to fund it, and no armies to defend it, only a hole in the ice, a line in the water, and patience. In this new, more fragmented ruse, ice fishing was not just a survival strategy. it became an act of stability. In some places, it was one of the few economic practices that remained unchanged amid the chaos. The northern principalities, ice as insulation from collapse. Regions like Novgorod, Pskov, and the forested territories of the upper Volga basin were spared the full fury of the Mongol invasion, either through strategic diplomacy, geographic isolation, or sheer fortune. These areas became centers of resilience and, eventually, renewal. Here, winter fishing traditions that had served the Kievan state quietly persisted, and in some cases, flourished. Novgorod continued to function as a semi-independent republic, its Vech, popular assembly, preserving local authority. Pskov, though smaller, developed a robust fishing economy tied to Lake Peipus and the surrounding rivers. Smaller villages thrived in the woods and marshes, beyond the interest of Mongol tribute collectors. These places maintained the tools, customs, and religious rhythms of ice fishing that had developed under earlier Kievan rule. Documents from a Novgorod boyar's estate, c. 1265, include detailed records of winter fish yields per week, tools assigned to serfs, portions delivered to the church, to markets, and to the boyar's household, rules regarding net repair, storage, and the sharing of frozen transport routes. In other words, while cities smoldered to the south, ice holes still opened to the north. Smoked pike and imperial tribute, fish as a currency of survival. Under Mongol rule, many Rus principalities were forced to pay annual tribute, usually in silver or furs. But in remote, resource-poor areas, fish became an alternate form of payment, particularly in winter, when frozen rivers allowed transport and fish remained preservable. A record from a tax collector in Tver, dated 1281, reads, 10 bundles of smoked pike and 7 of dried burbot received in place of silver, packed and marked for shipment south. Whether these were official payments or accepted out of necessity, they demonstrate that ice fishing remained economically relevant, even within the Mongol system. Villages that couldn't produce coin or grain offered fish, honey, and forest goods, a barter economy that leaned heavily on winter yields. This was especially true for monastic communities, which, though diminished in power, continued to operate smokehouses, fish ponds, and winter fish routes, often under the indirect protection of boyars or khans who benefited from their output. Rural continuity and the fisherman's life. In isolated settlements, life during the 13th and 14th centuries changed slowly, if at all. Fishing villages in the forests of the upper Volga, the lake country near Vologda, and the White Lake below Ozero region maintained local tool-making traditions, fishing calendars, and even oral laws governing shared ice holes and rotating access. Tools remained simple but efficient. Chisels of iron, sharpened on local whetstones. Horsehair lines, strengthened with wax or animal glue. Nets made from bast fibers, repaired by women during winter evenings. Floats crafted from bark or carved pine, often marked with family symbols. Fishing gear was now less likely to be taxed or confiscated, making it one of the few inherited technologies that remained intact across generations, despite imperial instability. Children learned to fish as their fathers and grandfathers had. Songs were sung over the holes. Fish were preserved in time-honored ways. If anything, the distance from central authority became a protection for tradition. The Church's new role, guardians of the cold craft. After the Mongol conquest, the Orthodox Church gained unprecedented spiritual authority, even as secular power fractured. Monasteries, which had always played a central role in ice fishing, now became even more essential. With many towns razed and trade limited, monasteries grew into local centers of economic stability, especially in the north. Records from the Kirillo-Belozersky Monastery, founded in 1397 on the shores of Lake Siverskoye show dozens of assigned ice fishing sites, dedicated winter fishing crews consisting of monks and hired villagers, fish preservation facilities, including salt pits and smokehouses, distribution, logs of dried fish for use during fasting seasons and delivery to Moscow. Monks, though cloistered, were proficient fishermen. They maintained tools, taught skills, and recorded harvests in ledgers now preserved in Russian archives. In some monasteries, ice fishing became a sacred ritual, begun each winter with a special liturgy, followed by the cutting of the first hole, often in the shape of a cross. This blend of spirituality and subsistence allowed fishing to remain culturally central, even as much of the state infrastructure crumbled. Fish for trade, fish for memory. Despite war and shifting rule, the fish kept moving. From the 13th to the early 15th centuries, Novgorod continued to export dried and smoked fish, especially smelt, burbot, and pike, to the Hanseatic League and internal Russian markets. Fish was packed in birchbark boxes, lined with hay or straw, then loaded onto sleds or riverboats depending on the season. These fish, caught through ice holes in January or February, might reach towns like Smolensk or even Riga by spring. Fishing villages that could maintain high-quality production found themselves back in the economic web, not as warriors or nobles, but as essential providers. And this quiet contribution was remembered. In local songs and folk tales, the ice fishermen of the Rus became a symbol of patience, humility, and wisdom. In one northern proverb, "When the river closes her mouth, the wise man listens deeper." Candle closing thoughts. Even in the wake of empire's fall, the cold endured. And through it all, the ice holes remained, modest, circular portals into another world, cut not for sport, not for luxury, but for life. The ice fishing systems of Kievan Rus did not end with a single event. They melted into the rhythms of local life, slowly absorbed by the cultures of Muscovy, Novgorod, and the rising Russian state. But the tools remained, the songs, the silent practice of watching the line, waiting without complaint and pulling life from stillness. Still, one wonders, how did the rise of Muscovy, with its appetite for centralization and power, transform the humble practice of ice fishing? And did these quiet lakeside traditions survive the age of czars? A new order, Muscovy rises from the frost. By the early 15th century, the power once held by the princes of Kievan Rus had consolidated under a new banner, Muscovy. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, once a minor principality, expanded steadily through diplomacy, marriage, and military conquest. By the late 1400s, it had positioned itself as the spiritual heir to Byzantium and the political successor to Rus. With that consolidation came bureaucracy, standardization, record-keeping, centralized authority. But amid this rising tide of state power, the ice fishing traditions born in the north and east did not vanish. Instead, they adapted, sometimes quietly, sometimes officially, to the new systems imposed from Moscow. The holes were still cut, the fish still caught, but now they served new ends, fulfilled new quotas, and fed new ambitions. This final section follows the transition from the fragmented survivalism of post-Mongol Rus to the imperial machinery of Muscovite Russia, tracing how the simple act of fishing through ice endured, and even flourished, beneath the gaze of the czars. Centralized control and the codification of fishing. One of the first signs of Muscovite influence on winter fishing comes from the Sudebnik of 1497, a legal code issued by Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow. While it does not directly address ice fishing, it expands state control over natural resources, including forests, lakes, and rivers. Soon after, more explicit documents emerge. Fishing taxes were levied on village catches, especially in regions producing surplus for trade. Fishing rights were formalized. often granted to monasteries, boyars, or loyal retainers. Violations of lake or river boundaries, including winter holes, became legal offenses. State scribes began issuing charters that described entire fisheries, including seasonal patterns, known catch types, and even assigned ice fishing seasons, tied to the liturgical calendar. These charters reveal a fascinating balance. The state sought control but relied on local knowledge. A 1524 land inventory from Yaroslavl includes: in the village of Luck, 3 winter holes on the south side of the river belonging to the monastery. Fishing to begin after the feast of St. Nicholas, using approved nets under supervision. Here we see ice fishing absorbed into the state's logic, not erased, but folded into a growing bureaucracy. Salted fish and the imperial table. The Muscovite state, with its expanding armies and courtly rituals, required a staggering quantity of preserved food, especially fish, due to religious fasting obligations that forbade meat for more than 150 days each year. Winter fish, especially pike, burbot, and smelt, became a prized staple. Large monasteries and estates in the north supplied dried and smoked fish to Moscow, salted barrels for long-distance transport, live fish kept in under-ice enclosures for Lent feast. Fishing was no longer just subsistence or local trade. It had become a state provisioning industry. Some fishing villages grew into seasonal centers of production, with designated freezing huts, fish packers, sled caravans, and fish salters. Many of these operations were run by or on behalf of the church, now firmly allied with the czarist regime. In fact, some of the czars themselves were avid supporters of monastic fisheries, using them as a means of asserting both piety and power. In a letter from Ivan the Terrible to the Solovetsky Monastery, 1551, he writes, "May the lakes yield fruit and frost, that the fast be kept holy. Send fish to the palace by Epiphany, for the boyars are many, and the table must be clean." Behind this royal language is a simple fact. Winter fish helped feed an empire, literally and spiritually. Innovation meets tradition, new tools, old habits. As Muscovy expanded, it absorbed technology from across its growing borders. Yet, in the realm of ice fishing, the innovations remained modest. Local ingenuity continued to prevail. Some changes included: improved chisels with detachable iron heads, larger transport sleds, often insulated with straw or wool, refined salting techniques, using brined barrels instead of open drying racks, organized fishing brigades, often including laborers from nearby peasant communities. Yet the essential acts, the cutting of the hole, the patience over the line, the singing of old chants while waiting, remained the same. Ice fishing retained its meditative rhythm, even as the state added paperwork and quotas. In oral histories collected centuries later, many northern fishermen still described the old way. Walking the lake's edge to find the softest spot in the wind. Cutting the ice at dawn so the light wouldn't spook the fish. Carrying a piece of wood carved by one's grandfather for good luck. In this way, the ancient and the modern coexisted, the empire above, the ice below. Documentation, folklore, and the persistence of memory. As Muscovy professionalized its record-keeping, more information about ice fishing entered the historical archive. Village ledgers, monastery accounts, and noble estate inventories often contain detailed data. Names of fishing workers. Tools used and maintained. Yields by month or species. Quotas delivered to Moscow or Novgorod. But just as important are the stories that survived in song and folklore. In one northern epic, Bylina, a humble fisherman uses his ice hole to hear the voice of the lake spirit, warning him of an army's approach. In another tale, a poor widow survives a harsh winter with a single net and the blessing of St. Nicholas, who keeps her hole open while others freeze. These are not factual histories, but they capture the emotional and cultural weight of winter fishing. They remind us that the tools, while simple, were sacred in the lives of those who used them. Decline and transformation. By the late 17th century, change came more rapidly. The population increased, leading to overfishing in certain lakes and rivers. Deforestation affected water quality and fish habitats. The state began favoring larger-scale fisheries closer to supply routes, leaving small communities behind. The use of salt and preserved imports grew, reducing reliance on small winter catches. And with the slow introduction of new technologies, some traditional methods were deemed inefficient or obsolete. Ice fishing did not disappear, but it receded into the background, no longer a linchpin of empire, but a fading echo of a time when a man and his line stood between hunger and survival. Still in the far north and east, families kept fishing. The lakes froze, the holes were cut, and the line was dropped once again into the deep. Final reflection. Ice fishing in Kievan Rus and Muscovite Russia was never glamorous. It left no golden artifacts, no battlefield songs, no cathedrals. But it left something more enduring, a rhythm of survival etched into the ice year after year. A reminder that history isn't only shaped by kings and conquerors, but by those who wait in silence for the line to twitch. The next time you see a frozen lake, smooth and still, imagine it dotted with small holes. Smoke rising, hooks sinking, the quiet empire of frost still breathing. And ask yourself, what other stories of endurance lie buried beneath the surface, unchanged, unnoticed, but never forgotten? Story 5. The Frozen Priory, Monks, Fasting, and Winter Fish. Introduction. A silence within the silence. Imagine a cloistered priory in northern Europe, its stone walls blanketed in snow, the cloister garth covered in hard frost, the chapel bell echoing through still air. Inside, monks kneel in silence. Outside, another silence reigns, that of ice. It is the year 1283. The priory sits on the edge of a frozen lake in what is now northern Germany. The brothers rise before dawn for matins, then silently don thick wool cloaks. Today, it is not scripture they seek, but sustenance. The lake has frozen over. The stores of grain are low, but the fish beneath the ice still swim, and God's mercy may yet be pulled up on a simple line. This story turns its attention to the monastic world of the Middle Ages, a world ruled by the rhythms of prayer, penance, and liturgical time. In this world, fish was more than food, it was obedience. It was discipline, and in winter it was a test of both faith and patience. Let us walk through the snow-crusted cloisters, follow the monks down to the ice, and learn how the spiritual needs of the medieval church shaped the physical tools and techniques of winter fishing. The rule of St. Benedict and the fish mandate. The foundation of most Western monastic life in the Middle Ages was the rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century. It governed every part of monastic life: prayer schedules, silence, labor, and, crucially, diet. According to the rule, monks were to avoid meat from four-legged animals, except in cases of illness. Instead, their protein came from legumes, eggs, and dairy, depending on order, and most consistently, fish. Fish was a permissible food even during periods of intense fasting. Monks often fasted on Wednesdays, Fridays during Lent, and on vigils before major feast days. In some stricter communities, especially Cistercians and Carthusians, fish was the only animal protein permitted year-round. This created a persistent, pressing need for fish. Monasteries located near rivers or lakes had a natural advantage. Those that didn't often constructed artificial fish ponds or developed trade relationships to bring in salted fish. But during harsh winters, when trade routes closed and ponds froze, the only option was ice fishing. Monks at the hole, who did the work? While we may imagine monks spending most of their lives in study or prayer, the rule of Saint Benedict emphasized manual labor as a spiritual act. Ora et labora, pray and work, defined their ethos. Most monasteries divided labor among brothers. Choir monks, who focused on liturgical duties. Lay brothers, or conversi, who performed manual labor including farming, cooking, and, yes, fishing. These lay brothers, often from peasant backgrounds, had practical knowledge of the land and water. When the lakes froze, it was these men, under the supervision of a cellarer or prior, who cut the holes, managed the lines, and pulled in the catch. That said, there are records of monks of all ranks participating in winter fishing, especially when food stores ran low or fasting days approached. A Cistercian chronicle from 1279 recounts, Brothers Thomas and Hugo, upon the vigil of St. Agnes, did strike the ice with iron and take from it 10 fish of middling size. Dio gracias. Fishing was a humble act, but also a spiritual practice, a means of living in submission to both God and nature. Records of the frozen labor. Surviving monastic ledgers give us rich insights into the practical side of winter fishing. In a preserved document from the Abbey of Lorsch in present-day Germany, we find a winter logbook for the year 1294. Under the heading De Piscibus Hemilibus, on winter fish, the entry reads, 4 chisels sharpened by Brother Arnulf, 2 nets unfrozen and laid under St. Mary's Lake, 27 perch pulled, smoked, and hung in the dormitory loft, 3 fish given to the poor at the gatehouse. This short entry tells us everything. Tools were named and maintained. Ice holes were strategic and sometimes dedicated to saints. Smoking and drying facilities were integrated into monastic architecture. Charity was a component of the catch's use. Another record from a French Cluniac priory, Burgundy, 1320, mentions the breaking of holes on the Vigil of Epiphany, after which the brethren processed to the lake's edge and recited Psalm 42, as the deer longs for streams of water, before the lines were dropped. Clearly, this was more than sustenance. It was a sanctified interaction with the natural world. Tools of the cloistered fishermen. The tools used by monks differed little from their secular counterparts, though they were often better maintained and sometimes ritually blessed. Common tools included iron chisels, kept sharp by the blacksmith monk or cellarer's assistants, stone weights for nets, many engraved with crosses or simple icons, horsehair or flax lines, woven during winter evenings by novice monks, simple floats, often made from cork or wood, painted white to match the snow and avoid bird predation. Nets were carefully stored in dry, elevated chambers, often near the calefactory warming room, to prevent rot. Hooks, floats, and lines were wrapped in cloth and placed in oiled wooden boxes, labeled with initials or feast day references. Some monasteries had dedicated fishing huts, constructed on the frozen lake each winter, simple wooden structures with straw roofs and a central opening. These offered shelter from the wind, and some included makeshift prayer stools for use while fishing. Fishing through the ice, then, was not idle labor. It was a choreographed balance of work, devotion, and obedience. Preservation and liturgical timing. Since fish were most needed during specific fasting periods, monasteries developed elaborate systems for preservation and storage. Smoking huts were constructed near water sources, with simple chimneys and racks for hanging fillets. Barrels of brine were stored in cold cellars for months. Some communities layered fish between salt and ice, using natural caves or shaded pits lined with straw. This ensured fish availability during Lent, 40 days leading to Easter; Advent, the season before Christmas; Ember days, quarterly fasting periods; the Vigils of Saint, days and major feasts. Because the liturgical calendar dictated when fish would be consumed, fishing itself had to occur well in advance, creating a seasonal urgency to winter fishing. Failure to secure enough fish could mean breaking the fast, an act not only of dietary failure but spiritual concern. Thus, the pressure to fish and fish successfully was immense. Fish as theology. The fish held powerful symbolism in Christian thought. Christ was often represented as a fish, the ichthyos, and early Christians used fish as a secret sign of their faith. Many of Christ's miracles involved fish: the loaves and fishes, the miraculous catch, the calling of fishermen as apostles. In medieval sermons, fish were often used as metaphors for the soul swimming through the waters of sin. This made the act of fishing, even in the dead of winter, a kind of spiritual reenactment. Monks saw themselves as both fishermen and fish, seekers of salvation, laborers for the kingdom, and humble servants sustained by God's bounty beneath the ice. In the monastic imagination, fishing was not just work, it was witness. Candle closing thoughts. As the snow settles on the lake and the monk kneels by the ice hole, a quiet scene unfolds. Breath visible in the air, fingers cracked from cold, the faint creak of wood. And then a twitch in the line. The fish rises, not just a meal but an answered prayer. This world, so structured and sacred, leaves us wondering. How did these spiritual traditions of winter fishing survive, or transform, during the upheaval of the Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries in the centuries that followed? From silence to shouting, reform breaks the ice. In the early 16th century, the carefully ordered world of the medieval monastery began to unravel. The Protestant Reformation, ignited in 1517 with Martin Luther's 95 Theses, swept across Europe, challenging not only papal authority and doctrine, but also the very economic and cultural structures that sustained monastic life. Among its many effects was the wholesale dissolution of monasteries in Protestant territories, particularly in England, parts of Germany and Scandinavia. What does this have to do with ice fishing? Quite a lot, actually. With monasteries came lakes, rivers, fishing rights, tools, fasting calendars, labor systems, and preservation infrastructure. When monasteries fell, so too did the systems that had quietly underpinned winter fishing across large swaths of northern Europe. This section traces the impact of the Reformation on monastic ice fishing traditions, showing how tools were lost, knowledge scattered, and in some cases, how communities clung to remnants of sacred routine long after the church had let go. The dissolution of the monasteries, an ice-covered collapse. Nowhere was the impact of religious reform more sudden or more complete than in England under Henry VIII. Between 1536 and 1541, under the dissolution of the monasteries, hundreds of religious houses were forcibly closed. Their lands and assets were seized by the crown, and monks were dispersed or pensioned off. Among the seized assets were fish ponds, smokehouses, ice fishing tools and winter provisions, records of fasting inventories and winter catch reports. A surviving inventory from an Augustinian priory in Lincolnshire, 1538 lists 2 iron ice spades, 3 nets with winter weights, 1 dried fish barrel unfinished, and 27 salted tench in the larder. The tools were auctioned, the ponds were drained or leased, and just like that, a centuries-old system of winter food security and spiritual labor was dismantled. In Protestant Germany and Scandinavia, the transition was sometimes more gradual but no less impactful. Monasteries were converted into schools or administrative centers. Their lakes became noble holdings. Fasting regulations were relaxed or abolished. With them went the need for large winter catches, ice-preserved fasting fish, prayers before fishing holes, dedicated monastic fishing crews. In these areas, ice fishing did not vanish, but it was no longer sacred. Surviving monastic communities, holding to the old calendar. In Catholic strongholds, particularly in parts of France, Italy, Poland, and Spain, many monastic communities endured the reforms. Some continued their ice fishing practices well into the 17th century, albeit often reduced in scale. The Cistercian monasteries of Central Europe remained particularly devoted to seasonal fishing as a core part of their fasting discipline. In records from a Czech monastery near Plzeň, dated 1575, we find notes on ice thickness required for safe net deployment, tools assigned to winter quarters, daily catches during ember days, liturgical readings recited before ice fishing began. These monasteries treated fishing as part of spiritual obedience, even as the secular world shifted toward commerce and rationalism. Still, economic pressures made themselves felt. Monasteries that once fished purely for self-sufficiency began selling surplus winter catch to nearby markets or noble households. This introduced competition, taxation, and eventually regulation of their fishing practices. Some resisted, others adapted, but the golden age of silent, self-contained monastic fishing was slowly melting away. Changing tastes and relaxed rules, the loosening of dietary restrictions across Protestant regions also played a role in the decline of monastic fishing culture. Where fasting once required the consumption of fish, particularly preserved fish during Lent and other observances, Protestant leaders removed or de-emphasized these rules, arguing that true faith did not reside in external abstinence. As a result, demand for winter fish declined. Pressure on fishing labor eased. The urgency of ice fishing as a religious duty evaporated. For centuries, monks had fished not simply to eat but to obey. Now that obedience was no longer mandated, either by faith or by law. Fewer monasteries trained new generations in ice fishing. Tools were left to rust. The small, cross-shaped holes in the ice were no longer seen as holy entries into nature's hidden bounty, but relics of superstition and papist tradition. The afterlife of monastic tools. Though the institutional frameworks collapsed, many of the tools and techniques developed by monasteries survived in secular hands. Ice chisels, once stored in priory cellars, ended up in village fishing sheds. Net designs were adopted by local fishermen, who respected monastic craftsmanship. Preservation techniques, layered brining, straw packing, winter drying lofts, continued to be used in rural fishing operations. Ceremonial practices, like cutting the first hole at Epiphany, lived on in folk tradition, detached from their original liturgical meaning. In some regions, locals still referred to particularly productive ice holes as the monk's spot or the brother's water. These were small echoes, but echoes nonetheless, of a once robust sacred fishing tradition. Candle echoes in art and folklore. Interestingly, even as the practice faded from institutional memory, it persisted in folk songs, carvings, and religious imagery. In one 16th century French illuminated manuscript, a marginalia illustration shows a monk in full habit, hunched beside an ice hole, a net strung with fish, a faint halo drawn around the head of the largest fish, a nod to spiritual abundance. In rural Polish winter songs collected in the 18th century, one stanza reads, "Brother cut the ice at dawn, brother prayed until the fish were drawn, bread was none. But pike was plenty, Lent was long, but God was plenty." Such fragments offer emotional continuity, even when the practice itself had changed or ended. The spiritual memory of winter fishing, the silence, the devotion, the simplicity, was not easily forgotten. The turn to modernity. By the dawn of the 18th century, monasteries across Europe had largely ceased direct involvement in ice fishing, but their influence endured in subtle ways. Many monastic lakes and fishing rights were absorbed into estate systems, and operated with inherited practices. Fish preservation standards developed in religious houses shaped early commercial fishmongering. Ice fishing methods honed over centuries were adopted into rural economies, secularized but intact. Some religious orders that remained, particularly in Eastern Europe, continued small-scale winter fishing well into the 19th century. What had once been sacred had become practical tradition, no longer sung in Latin or blessed with holy water, but whispered between generations. The last true monastic ice fishermen likely lived out their days in silence, never knowing they were the end of a lineage that had, for centuries, pulled faith and fish alike from frozen depths. Candle closing thoughts. As we stand by the ice hole, watching the line disappear into blackness, we remember the monks, not as symbols of austerity, but as men who saw God in the cold, who labored without recognition, and who trusted that beneath the surface, something would rise. And we ask, in a world where silence has grown rare, where faith is less bound to frost and ritual, can anything of that quiet monastic discipline still be found, waiting in the ice? The cold remains. The priory is long abandoned. The stone walls are mossy now. The chapel's bell no longer tolls through the snowy air, but the lake still freezes. The ice still groans under the weight of winter. And in certain villages, someone still walks out at dawn, carves a small hole in the surface, and lowers a line in silence. What was once a spiritual obligation, part of a vast religious framework encompassing faith, food, and fasting, is now a personal rhythm, a family custom, a cultural whisper. This final section explores how the monastic traditions of winter fishing, though officially ended by reforms and revolutions, persisted quietly, transformed, and re-emerged in new forms across rural Europe. Their survival is not in doctrine or scripture, but in practice, place, and memory. Lakes of memory, how the monastic landscape lingered. Even after monasteries dissolved or declined, their physical presence and their influence on land and water did not simply vanish. Across Germany, France, England, and Poland, many former monastic sites retained. Fish ponds and man-made lakes designed for seasonal catches. Ice houses and smoke sheds, originally built by lay brothers. Place names referencing fish, monks, or specific saints tied to water, e.g., St. Peter's Pond, Monksbrook, or La Frie, meaning place where the friars fished. Old roads leading from cloisters to winter fishing spots, now used by shepherds or travelers, but still bearing grooves carved by cartwheels full of salted pike. A 1730 land survey in northern France noted a lake of the monks, Lac des Moines, as part of an estate deed, though no monastic house remained nearby. Local farmers still fished it in winter, unaware their practice mirrored that of men in Cowles 5 centuries earlier. The land held the memory, even when the church no longer claimed it. Monastic technique in rural tradition. Even without monks, the techniques honed in cloistered communities filtered into rural hands. Elderly villagers in parts of Bavaria and Bohemia, interviewed in the early 20th century, recalled their grandparents using the Brothers' Hole, a term for a specific ice fishing spot used every winter, originally marked by a monastery. Rituals of silence while fishing, not strictly religious, but out of respect for the fish and the water. Methods of salting fish in layers with straw or snow, matching preservation strategies found in monastic ledgers. Early morning fish offerings left on chapel steps during Advent, remnants of almsgiving once practiced under strict Benedictine rule. In these rural echoes, we find something profound. Techniques once tied to spiritual obedience became embedded in cultural muscle memory, surviving the end of their institutional source. Monastic influence on secular ice fishing guilds. As monastic systems declined, secular organizations filled the void, especially in towns and regions where fishing was economically important. In parts of Poland and Hungary, ice fishing guilds emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, not just for commercial summer fisheries, but specifically for winter yields. These guilds took over monastic lakes and fisheries, adopted rules of conduct and silence during fishing, maintained tools such as marked chisels, communal nets, and handmade floats, kept records of catch sizes, echoing the detailed ledgers once kept in cloister cellars. Though their language became mercantile, their structure often mirrored the discipline of monasteries. Ranked members apprenticed to master. Seasonal rituals, opening the ice at Epiphany or Candlemas. Prohibitions against fishing on holy days, even in Protestant areas where the church no longer dictated such rules. The spiritual became secular, but not forgotten. From fast to feast, the cultural shift in fish consumption. With fasting restrictions eased or abolished across Protestant Europe, fish consumption declined in spiritual importance, but rose in cultural and culinary relevance. The irony is clear. The fish once pulled from the ice by monks as a bland Lenten necessity became winter delicacies, enjoyed in feasts, holidays, and even court banquets. In Norway, dried winter cod stockfish, once a monastic staple, became a prized export. In parts of France and Spain, saltfish dishes made their way onto Christmas tables. Some of these dishes preserved monastic origins in name. Brandade de Morue from Provence was linked to early Benedictine fasting recipes. Carp po żydowsku, Jewish-style carp, in Poland, though a secular holiday dish, used preservation techniques found in monastic kitchens. Gefilte fish, prepared in Central and Eastern Europe, reflects winter catch preservation using pre-modern fish processing methods. Thus, even as the religious significance faded, the practical ingenuity and culinary patterns of monks lived on in evolving local customs. A return to the ice, revival, romance, and rediscovery. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Europe underwent a wave of romanticization of the past. Monasteries were rebuilt, revived, or restored. Historical societies published old ledgers. Tourists began to walk the ancient paths of monks. In this atmosphere of rediscovery, the quiet act of monastic ice fishing was reimagined, not as labor, but as heritage. Some examples. In Germany's Black Forest, a 19th-century reconstruction of a Benedictine fishing hut was built beside a winter lake for educational use. In Poland, local festivals near former Cistercian sites began reenacting the cutting of the holy hole, complete with monks' robes and wooden nets. In Switzerland, winter retreats at former monastic lodges incorporated ice fishing as meditation, echoing the quiet, contemplative labor of old. These weren't literal revivals of monastic practice, but reflections of longing, an attempt to connect to a world where work, silence, and faith were woven together beneath the winter sky. Stillness and the spiritual memory of ice. Perhaps what endures most is not the structure, not the institution, but the feeling. Modern ice fishers, sitting in silence over a frozen lake, often speak of something familiar to those monks of old. The hush of snow, the patience of the wait, the invisible life moving below, the strange peace that comes when time slows. These feelings, while not cloaked in liturgy, echo the same spiritual rhythm that drove monks to pray, fast, and labor through the frost. The hole in the ice is not only a place to fish, it is still a place to listen. Candle final reflection. When the monastery fell silent, the lake did not. When the prayers ceased, the water still held life. When the rules were lifted, the line was still cast. This is the legacy of the frozen priory, not carved in stone or etched in glass, but preserved in the memory of water, in the smoke of fish gently drying, in the patient hum of quiet labor. And so we ask, what other forgotten rituals, once born of faith, now live on quietly in our habits, unrecognized, perhaps, but still shaping the way we meet the world. Story 6. Traders on the Ice. How Fish Fueled Hanseatic Commerce. The Hanseatic world begins. It begins, as so many stories of cold commerce do, with a fish. Specifically, herring. By the 13th century, the North Sea and Baltic Sea teemed with shoals of this small, oily fish. In an age when the Christian calendar restricted meat consumption for much of the year, Lent, Advent, Fridays, and countless feast eves, herring became indispensable. But it wasn't merely eaten. It was preserved, packed in barrels, shipped by the ton, and transformed into the lifeblood of trade in Northern Europe. This is the story of how ice, fish, and faith combined to power one of the most formidable merchant alliances in medieval history, the Hanseatic League. We'll begin with the rise of herring's importance in the Middle Ages, the seasonal migrations that drew traders to icy ports, and the techniques of preservation and logistics that turned winter fish into currency. You'll see how, even in bitter cold, ships were loaded, deals were struck, and frozen harbors buzzed with commerce. This is not a tale of kings or battles, but of barrels, salt, and frozen docks, the quiet, logistical triumphs that helped shape European history. Why herring? Unlike pike or perch, herring was a mass fish, migrating in enormous shoals, often predictable in season and location. The most famous herring fisheries emerged near Scania, southern Sweden, then part of Denmark, the Baltic coasts of Pomerania and Prussia, the Kattegat and Skagerrak straits between modern Denmark and Norway. Every autumn, the herring would come to spawn in the shallows, right as the air chilled and winter descended on the north. Fishermen would gather by the thousands, their small boats launched before dawn, while ice formed in the reeds along the shoreline. And then came the merchants, the ice market towns. Each year from the 1200s through the early 1500s, temporary herring towns sprang up in places like Skanör and Falsterbo. These weren't permanent cities, but seasonal market hubs, built from timber and tents, frozen into place by the coming frost. What happened in these towns? Fishing crews caught the herring and delivered them in wicker baskets. Workers packed the fish into barrels, layering them with salt. Merchants, many from Lübeck, Rostock, and Hamburg, arrived to buy, inspect, and transport. Ice was used to slow spoilage, keep barrels chilled, and extend storage life before shipping. As the sea itself began to freeze at the edges, these ice-choked towns continued operating. Trade did not sleep for winter. The use of sledges, frozen pathways, and wooden skis allowed goods to be transported even as snow blanketed the roads. This was not a glamorous trade. It was harsh, cold, repetitive, and entirely essential. Hanseatic expansion, networks on ice. By the late 13th century, dozens of northern cities had begun banding together for mutual benefit in trade, defense, and navigation. This alliance would become known as the Hanseatic League, a loose confederation of market towns united by the need to protect shipping routes and standardize commerce. What began as a merchant's agreement grew into an economic empire, controlling Baltic trade routes, key ports from Bruges to Novgorod, warehouses in London, Bergen, and even inland towns, the majority of Northern Europe's fish and salt trade. Herring, and especially winter-preserved herring, was foundational. Lübeck, often called the Queen of the Hands, became the nerve center. Here, fish arrived in frozen barrels on sledges and carts, or by ship when the sea allowed. Warehouse walls were lined with ice blocks and straw to insulate storage. Clerks recorded fish weights, salt volumes, and delivery times with exacting precision. The League invested in standard barrel sizes, quality grading for salted herring, preservation laws to avoid spoilage and scandal. Incredibly, all of this functioned in a world without refrigeration. It was ice and salt, managed with discipline, that made it work. Salt, the hidden commodity. Herring was nothing without salt, and salt was scarce in the frozen north. Much of the Hanseatic League's logistics revolved around acquiring, transporting, and preserving salt supplies. Key sources included Bay of Biscay, French Atlantic salt pans; Lumberg saltworks in northern Germany; Iberian coast, traded up through Bruges. Salt had to be brought by ship in summer or early autumn, stockpiled before the roads froze. It was measured in stones and was often stored in ice-insulated vaults for use in winter herring packing. An average preserved herring barrel required 1 layer of herring, 1 layer of coarse salt, repeated up to 12 layers, sealed with waxed cloth or resin caps. In some towns, salt was more valuable than gold during harsh winters. In others, fish were used as a barter item for salt, grain, or wool. This salty economy kept hands busy even when the harbors froze. Winter logistics, trade over ice. When the sea routes froze, the League didn't stop. Instead, they adapted. In many northern regions, frozen rivers and lakes became highways. Caravans of sledges, drawn by horses or even men, moved fish, salt, and other goods across the ice. Merchants tracked ice thickness by pole measurements, temperature trends using sunshadow clocks, risk zones with wooden stakes or flags. Some towns even created ice toll points, where sledges paid fees to cross certain frozen paths. These were temporary and vanished with spring, but while they stood, they were carefully regulated. In rare cases, entire trading fairs were held on frozen rivers, complete with stalls, weights, scales, and barrels stacked high beside crackling fires. One Lübeck trader, writing in 1378, noted, "The lake was frozen, but we moved 50 carts of barrelfish to Rostock. The sound of sledges echoed like bells." Frozen water was no obstacle, it was an asset. Records and regulation. Because the Hanseatic League depended on precision and reputation, they kept detailed records. Arrival logs at docks, weight and salt content of herring barrels, notes on spoilage, freezing temperatures, and ice delays, contracts stipulating delivery before the Feast of St. Thomas or when the ice permits. Documents show how merchants factored in ice melt forecasts, often relying on monks or city clerks trained in basic meteorology. These entries may seem dull, lists of fish, barrels, weather, but together they paint a picture of a highly developed winter trade culture, sustained by patience, calculation, and cold. Candle closing thoughts. The Hanseatic League was not built by conquest. It was built by systems, by the careful movement of goods, the weighing of fish, the packing of salt, and the trust in ice. The fish that swam beneath the surface became the foundation of wealth above it. The ice, often seen as a barrier, became the very road to prosperity. And so we ask, in a world of speed and abundance, what can we learn from the patience and discipline of those who moved fish and fortune across frozen seas? The business of frozen water. It is winter in Lübeck. The harbor has frozen over. Ships rest idle, their hulls creaking beneath a crust of ice. Yet the work does not stop. In the narrow streets behind the merchant warehouses, barrels are being packed, sledges are being loaded, and clerks scratch their quills across parchment. This is not silence. It is industry, an industry honed by the Hanseatic League to operate on ice, through frost, and amid scarcity. Herring remains king, but winter complicates everything. Now, trade routes must be measured not in nautical miles, but in ice thickness, sledge load capacity, and frost longevity. In this section, we delve deeper into how the Hanseatic League's fish trade adapted to the winter months, not just with grit and labor, but with administrative precision, logistical foresight, and an early form of cold chain management centuries before refrigeration was invented. Lübeck, the cold heart of the League. The city of Lübeck, founded in the 12th century and rising to prominence in the 13th and 14th centuries, became the de facto capital of the Hanseatic League. Its location near the Baltic made it a natural hub for herring arriving from Scania, Riga, and other fisheries. But in winter, Lübeck's harbor was often unusable for ships. Instead, goods arrived via overland routes or across frozen rivers. Merchants stored fish in cold cellars beneath the city. Warehouses were reinforced with straw insulation and layered ice, carved from nearby lakes in early December. Barrels were rotated weekly to prevent uneven freezing and preserve quality. These practices weren't considered innovative, they were simply necessary. The city government kept strict protocols on fish storage, including weight limits per barrel to prevent bursting when frozen, salt ratios for winter curing, rotational schedules to maintain airflow in cellar storage, inspection rosters for city-appointed fish checkers, Fiskinspektoren. Trade in Lübeck was a seasonal science governed by experience and routine. The tools of cold commerce. The fish trade required an astonishing array of tools, each adjusted for the demands of the season. Among the more common implements used during winter months: ice picks and chisels, used to break lake ice for transport water; barrel rolling cradles, padded to avoid cracking staves in sub-zero temperatures; salt caking tools, to layer cured herring uniformly in frosted conditions; snow shovels, not for clearing streets, but for insulating cold cellars with snow packs. Special mention must be made of the sledges, flat-bottomed transport carts with wide runners, often covered in animal hide for improved glide. Horses or oxen pulled them through snow-packed roads or directly across frozen lakes. Some sledges were designed with canvas hood to prevent snow from entering saltfish barrels, wooden braces to stack multiple barrels securely, iron runners that could be removed or replaced, depending on terrain. In Hanseatic cities, winter wasn't idle time. It was infrastructure season, a moment to move goods that couldn't be moved by sea and store those that had to last until spring. Merchant discipline and cold calendars. Hanseatic merchants were known for their meticulous record-keeping. Winter added another layer of complexity: temperature-based logistics. In surviving merchant journals from the 14th and 15th centuries, we find entries such as February 2, cellar 3 reached low temp, no frostbite on outer barrels. Rotate south stack to rear. Ice layer holding. Awaiting additional salt from Bremen via sledge. January 14, fish from Riga arrived frozen. 28 barrels, high salt, condition excellent. Delivered to Bruges contingent by Candlemas, weather permitting. These weren't idle notes. They formed a working manual for operations. Decisions depended on air temperature forecasts, estimated using sunrise length and ice thickness; fasting calendars, which dictated when demand would spike; ecclesiastical calendars, to determine feast eves and no-meat days; travel viability, measured by whether wagons or sledges were usable. Merchants coordinated shipments not only by price and volume, but by ice melt projections, a chillingly literal early version of the supply chain. The barrel and the blessing. Salted herring was most prized when properly packed and blessed. In some ports, even after Protestant reforms, merchants maintained the old tradition of praying over the first barrel packed for the year. In cities like Danzig, modern Gdansk, the blessing might include a candle lit over the barrel head, a brief prayer for safe transport and good markets, a cross scratched into the wax seal, not for show, but for superstition and safety. The fish wasn't just food, it was capital, and spiritual capital at that. Each barrel could be sold whole to cities like Bruges or Bergen, broken down and resalted for local consumption, bartered for wool, grain, or metal. Some were even offered as tithes, with the best barrel sent to a sponsoring bishop, abbey, or cathedral as a gesture of goodwill and economic allegiance. In this way, salted fish functioned as currency, and the integrity of that currency was determined by how well it was handled in winter. When the ice failed, of course, not every winter cooperated. Records from 1392 tell of a mild winter along the Baltic. The ice didn't form as usual. Roads became muddy instead of snow-packed. Sea harbors remained slushy, unsafe for large ships. This led to missed deliveries to major market towns, spoiled barrels that thawed before proper storage, rising prices for Lent season herring, unusual alliances where rival towns shared transport sledges. That year, several Hanseatic cities issued emergency declarations. Let it be known that all fish packed before the third Sunday after Epiphany shall be deemed free of levy, that the salt may not be wasted. Winter's unpredictability required flexible systems and constant adaptation. The League's resilience wasn't in its rules, but in its ability to navigate ice and absence alike. The reach of the cold chain. From these cold harbors and frozen roads, Hanseatic fish traveled astonishing distances. A well-packed barrel could reach Bruges within 3-4 weeks. Novgorod by overland sled caravan in 5-6 weeks. Bergen in spring once ice thawed, with fish still viable due to careful salt packing. Once delivered, herring supported. Urban diets during fasting. Naval rations for maritime powers. Rural households lacking local catch. In many ways, this network of preservation and delivery prefigured modern logistics. It was a proto-industrial system built on salt, sledges, timing, and faith in the freeze. Candle closing thoughts. In the modern age, we measure time in speed, overnight shipping, 2-day delivery, rapid transit. But in the Hanseatic world, cold was currency, and time was measured by frost. The merchants of the League didn't merely sell fish. They learned to trust winter, to read its signs, and to organize a trade empire around its rhythms. Their success came not from domination, but from knowing how to move when others stopped. And so we ask, if today's world lost its machines and electricity, would we still know how to live and trade by the cold, as the Hanseatic did with only barrels, salt, and snow? The ice begins to crack. The success of the Hanseatic League was never built on conquest or glory, it was built on systems. Cold systems, calculated ones. But even the most well-oiled machine is vulnerable to change. And in the case of the League, the very tools that made it dominant, barrels, salt, and seasonal cold, could not protect it from the tides of modernity. In this final section, we witness the gradual unraveling of Hanseatic trade dominance, tracing how innovations in fishing, politics, and economics slowly pushed the League to the margins of history. Yet even as its formal power waned, its legacy remained preserved, like salted fish in a winter barrel. We'll look at the technological and political factors behind the League's decline, the survival of its practices in other forms, the eerie parallels between medieval cold chain trade and modern logistics, and the quiet afterlife of ice-based commerce in the cities it once ruled. This is a story not of collapse, but of transformation, and the way even frozen systems can flow into new channels. Competition melts the monopoly. By the late 15th century, several cracks had appeared in the League's icy armor. 1. The rise of nation-states. As centralized kingdoms like Denmark, Sweden, and Poland gained strength, they sought to exert more control over their own ports, fisheries, and tariffs, chipping away at the League's monopolies. Royal charters replaced merchant treaties. Kings wanted taxes, not trade privileges. 2. The Dutch challenge. The Dutch Republic, especially after gaining independence from Spain, introduced innovations in ship design, e.g. the flight, which carried more cargo with fewer crew. fishing techniques, such as open-sea herring currying on the boat. Commercial networks reaching beyond the Baltic. The Dutch began to outcompete Hanseatic traders, both in speed and volume. No longer bound to wait for frozen harbors, they sailed year-round. 3. The shift in tastes and preservation. Improved salting methods and the spread of smoking technology diversified preserved fish offerings. New foods from the Americas and improved storage reduced reliance on herring. Demand did not vanish, but it was no longer absolute. From league to legacy, the slow dissolution. The Hanseatic League was never a single nation or government. It was a coalition of cities bound by economic interests. As those interests diverged, so did the unity. By the early 1600s, the League had largely lost influence in England and the Low Countries. Its contours, trading offices in Bruges, London, and Bergen were shuttered or taken over. Lübeck and Hamburg attempted to maintain authority, but were increasingly seen as relics of another age. Still, the League lingered, formally existing until the 17th century and even into the 1800s in ceremonial or symbolic form. Its towns adapted. Some became port cities under national governments. Others turned inland, becoming centers of manufacture or education. But the great caravans of sledges packed with fish, the frostbitten clerks tracking barrel quotas by candlelight, those faded into memory. And yet, the echoes of cold trade. The systems the League pioneered, barrel-based preservation, standardized weights and measures, ice-insulated storage, and seasonal shipping windows, outlived the League itself. In fact, many survived well into the modern era. Cold storage warehouses in northern ports were built on foundations of Hanseatic cellar models. Rail-based transport of preserved goods followed many of the same routes used by winter sledges. The concept of frozen highways, used today in Arctic trucking, bears uncanny similarity to the ice roads from Lübeck to inland towns. And in terms of administrative practice, the League. Ledger formats, salt specifications, merchant guild structures were adopted or imitated by future trade alliances, even as far away as the British Empire. The League died, but its DNA entered the bloodstream of modern logistics. Winter festivals and frozen memory. In cities like Visby, Tallinn, and Riga, traces of the League remain, most obviously in architecture, warehouses, towers, merchant halls, but also in tradition. Several towns now host Hanseatic winter markets, where goods are traded in old coin denominations. Herring festivals, tied loosely to the League's peak fishing seasons. Historical reenactments of barrel packing and frozen trade caravans. In Lübeck, one street is still called Fischstrasse, Fish Street, where merchants once packed fish by torchlight under a blanket of snow. These are more than pageants. They are acts of remembrance, and perhaps quiet acts of admiration for a world where the cold was not an obstacle, but a partner. Fish in the age of refrigeration. Today you can buy herring in a can from anywhere in the world. No snow, no salt barrel, no ice cellar, just a sterile aisle in a grocery store. And yet, beneath that convenience lies a continuum stretching back to the frozen Baltic docks, the silent harbors, the rows of straw-packed cellars beneath the Hanseatic cities. Refrigerated trucks are descended from sledges. Insulated cargo containers are modern barrels, and inventory control software is just an echo of the clerks in Lübeck, hunched over parchment, tracking a barrel's weight by candlelight. If you listen closely, in the silence of a refrigerated warehouse, you might still hear the creak of a wooden sledge, or the crunch of snow under the boots of a merchant. Candle final reflection. The League began with a fish, a small, oily fish pulled from icy waters and packed in salt, meant to nourish a fasting population. From that came systems. From systems came cities. and from cities came a culture of cold commerce that lasted centuries. It didn't end with a crash. It ended with a thaw, a slow melting away of relevance, as new powers rose and new methods emerged. But in every snow-covered port, in every wooden beam of a Hanseatic warehouse, and in every preserved fish passed from hand to hand, there remains a fragment of the great northern trade empire. And so we ask, in a time of instant logistics and climate uncertainty, what wisdom remains hidden in the cold patience of frozen trade? Story 7. Under the Ice in Japan, Ainu Winter Fishing Rituals. Cloud with snow in the land of snow and silence. Far to the north of Japan's main islands lies a rugged, windswept land. Hokkaido, where the winters are long, the snow is deep, and the rivers freeze with a firm and glittering grip. Long before the island was formally colonized by Japan in the 19th century, it was home to the Ainu people, an indigenous group whose culture, language, and traditions bore little resemblance to those of the Japanese to the south. The Ainu were not an imperial people. They built no castles, raised no armies, and left no written records of conquest. Instead, they lived closely with nature, especially with the rivers, lakes, and forests of Hokkaido. Among their most remarkable traditions was winter river fishing, a practice both practical and spiritual, conducted beneath the ice in reverent silence. This story begins in the stillness of a frozen river, where an Ainu elder kneels beside a carefully carved hole, murmuring a prayer to unseen spirits. His tools are simple. His breath fogs the air, and the fish he seeks is not just sustenance. It is a gift from the kami, the spiritual beings who animate the natural world. In this section, we'll explore the world of the Ainu, who they were, how they lived, and how winter fishing shaped their survival and belief system. As always, the story will remain grounded in the boring, but beautiful details of daily life, where resilience was as quiet as falling snow. Who were the Ainu? The Ainu are the indigenous people of northern Japan, especially Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands. Their origins are complex and still debated, but they are generally believed to descend from Jomon-era peoples, hunter-gatherers who inhabited Japan thousands of years before the arrival of rice agriculture. Unlike their southern neighbors, the Ainu did not practice large-scale agriculture, lived in small villages near rivers and coasts, built homes of woven reed and bark, heated by central hearths, maintained an oral tradition, passing stories and rituals through song and chant. Most importantly, they saw the world as inhabited by kami, spiritual entities present in animals, weather, water, fire, and even fish. Every act of hunting or fishing was part of a larger relationship between humans and these beings. One did not take from nature. One received with humility and ritual. Winter as teacher and trial. Hokkaido's winters were, and are, intense. Snowfall averages could exceed 10 meters in some regions. Temperatures regularly dropped below degrees C. In this environment, ice fishing was not just a food-gathering method, but a critical survival skill and a carefully timed tradition. Unlike in temperate fishing cultures, the Ainu did not fish indiscriminately. Timing, location, and ritual mattered. Key seasonal patterns included autumn salmon runs, caught in weirs and nets. Early winter trapping, before rivers froze fully. Deep winter ice fishing, practiced in January and February on frozen lakes and slow rivers. Spring eel catching, tied to lunar cycles. Fish provided protein during lean months, especially when game was scarce. Dried and smoked fish were stored in roof racks, sometimes stacked with snow for insulation. The fish most commonly caught under ice included iwashi Japanese sardine, ayu sweetfish, although more seasonal, haimasu landlocked cherry salmon, yugui dace, pond smelt, known locally as wakasagi. These were not just meals. They were ritual offerings, economic resources, and symbols of life granted by the spirits. Rituals of the ice. Unlike commercial ice fishing, which often prizes efficiency, Ainu fishing was spiritual in its approach. Before fishing began, the head of the family or an elder fisherman would select the site carefully, based on dream guidance, ancestral advice, or signs in nature. Cut a hole in the ice with an adze-like blade, often iron or stone in earlier times, wide enough to allow light to pass. Place a carved stick, called an ino, beside the hole to honor the kami of the river. Offer prayers, sometimes including a pinch of tobacco or a few grains of millet, into the hole. A chant might follow. Kami of the water, we greet you. We ask your gift with humble hands. May our spears be true. May our bellies be filled. You who swim, forgive us and return again. The fish once caught was handled with care. First catch was never eaten immediately, but offered to the hearth or fire cam. Bones were not discarded haphazardly, but returned to the river to honor the spirit of the animal. Fish eyes, believed to hold spiritual potency, were sometimes dried and worn in small pouches for protection during winter travel. Tools of the Ainu ice fisher. The equipment used by the Ainu was utilitarian, often handmade, and passed down through generations. Primary tools included kawep, a short wooden spear or hook used to catch fish under the ice. Makiri, a versatile Ainu knife, used to clean and process fish. Ino, ritual sticks made of shaved wood curls, set beside ice holes for spiritual balance. Tirep, a sort of basket trap, used less commonly in winter but sometimes sunk below the ice. Fish baskets woven from inner tree bark, designed to prevent freezing while draining excess water. Fishing holes were kept from freezing over with pine branches, straw mats, or oiled cloths, depending on availability. One interesting technique involved listening to the ice. Experienced fishers would kneel beside the hole and place a hand, or even an ear, on the ice to feel vibrations of movement below. Silence was essential. Any loud voice was considered disrespectful to the kami and might scare off the fish. Compass, mapping the invisible. The Ainu did not draw maps on parchment or vellum. Instead, they mapped rivers in memory, naming pools, bends, and rapids not with coordinates but with stories. A particular bend in the river might be called where the bear watched, where the water spoke at dawn, place of the three fish. These names encoded practical information, depth, current speed, fish behavior, but also honored ancestral memory. During winter fishing, a family might return to the same ice hole used by a grandfather or great-grandmother, even if the location had changed slightly due to shifting currents. The hole was remembered not by GPS, but by trees nearby, stories, or shadows on the snow. This was survival through narrative, geography as heritage. Candle closing thoughts. The Ainu did not build vast empires, nor did they write their history in stone. But in the simple act of kneeling beside a frozen river and whispering thanks before fishing, they expressed a worldview as rich and layered as any civilization. Their winter fishing was never just extraction. It was conversation between human and fish, ice and breath, spirit and survival. And so we ask, in a world that often takes from nature without pause, what might we learn from those who carved holes in ice not to conquer, but to ask permission? Snow living between ice and empire. By the early 17th century, the Ainu way of life, centered around subsistence, spiritual reciprocity, and seasonal rhythm, began to face its greatest challenge: external control. As the Tokugawa shogunate tightened its grip on Japan, its influence expanded northward. While Hokkaido, then called Izo, was geographically distant from Edo, modern Tokyo, its strategic value was not lost on the Japanese. Rich in natural resources, from fur-bearing animals to abundant fisheries, Izo became a quiet frontier in Japan's imperial ambitions. But for the Ainu, the ice remained. The rivers still froze. The smelt still swam beneath the surface. And though commerce and colonial pressure mounted around them, winter fishing continued, now as both tradition and a quiet act of cultural resistance. In this section, we explore the transformation of Ainu winter fishing from a purely subsistence spiritual act to one that subtly pushed back against colonization. You'll see how the Ainu preserved their identity not by fighting battles, but by maintaining ritual, retelling stories, and casting lines beneath the snow-covered silence. Canoe: the expansion of Japanese trade. By the 1600s, Japanese traders, especially from the Matsumi domain, were increasingly active along Hokkaido's southern and western coasts. While direct settlement was limited, the Matsumi clan monopolized trade with the Ainu, offering rice, metal tools, and cloth in exchange for animal pelts, especially bear and otter, dried fish, seaweed, and marine goods. Winter fish became a significant trade item. Preserved under snow or salt, smelt and trout were transported by sled to trade posts, but the terms of trade were rarely fair. The Ainu were often forced into one-sided deals and sometimes coerced into fishing exclusively for Matsumi representatives. And yet, amidst this growing pressure, many Ainu families retreated to inland rivers during the harshest winter months, not to escape the cold, but to escape the reach of merchants. Here, under the ice, tradition could continue unobserved. Snowflake ceremony in the cold, rituals unseen. Even under duress, Ainu ritual did not disappear, it adapted. During winter months, certain ceremonies were observed in secret or in miniature, especially those tied to the kami of water, who governed the fish in the river ice, the household hearth deity, who maintained warmth and food, the animal spirits, honored in every successful hunt or catch. One particularly significant ritual was the fish kami send-off, chep kaminomi, a small rite performed after a winter fishing session. A fish bone or fin would be placed near the fire, accompanied by words such as, "Return, O spirit, to your watery home. Tell your kind we thank them. Come again when you are ready." This wasn't just animism. It was resilience through spiritual etiquette, a way of preserving identity even as political autonomy waned. When colonial officials banned certain Ainu festivals in later centuries, these smaller winter rites endured precisely because they were quiet, mobile, and easily woven into daily tasks. Fishing under the ice became not only spiritual, but subtly defiant. Muted speaker: the language of ice holes. Language, too, was a form of resistance. Each ice hole carved into a river carried a name in the Ainu tongue. These names were not written down, but spoken aloud as part of the fishing process, repeating ancestral phrases like Siupang Cotton, where the willow bends; Kamai Seppo, fish place of the spirits; Nupur Kapet, river that sleeps beneath snow. As Japanese language instruction was forced upon younger Ainu in the 19th century, and oral traditions began to fade, winter fishing remained one of the last spaces where Ainu language lived freely. To carve a hole in the ice and whisper its name was not merely to fish, it was to speak back to a world erasing you. Fishing pole technology and tradition. Over time, Japanese fishing tools and methods entered Ainu practice. Iron hooks replaced bone. Rice straw was used to insulate baskets, but the Ainu did not abandon their own methods. Even when fishing with new tools, they retained ritual order, always blessing the first catch. Maintained selective fishing, only taking what was needed. Preserved ice listening as a skill. Continued to return bones to the water, even if Japanese traders discarded them. When asked by officials to explain why they continued such superstitions, some Ainu elders replied simply, "Because the river listens." That answer required no justification. Cloud with snow living memory, Winter camp stories. During the long nights of winter fishing expeditions, Ainu families would camp near the river, tents set up under trees, fires built from driftwood or pine. Inside these shelters, stories were told, not for amusement but as acts of continuity. Children were taught the names of rivers their ancestors fished, the rituals to avoid offending the Kama, the proper songs to sing while preparing fish for drying, how to interpret animal tracks near the ice holes. One common tale recounted the story of a man who fished too greedily, taking more than he could carry, only to fall through the ice on his return. The moral was not one of divine punishment, but of disharmony with nature, with the spirits, and with one's own limits. In this way, each winter catch was tied to memory, not only personal but communal. Chart decreasing pressure and persistence. By the late 1800s, Japanese colonization of Hokkaido intensified. The Meiji government launched aggressive campaigns to assimilate the Ainu, banning traditional dress, seizing land, and forbidding certain spiritual practices. Many Ainu were relocated or forced into wage labor. And yet, in the quiet of the forests, on frozen tributaries far from official checkpoints, winter fishing continued. It was often smaller in scale, single families, brief outings, simplified gear, but the essence remained. Holes were still carved with reverence, offerings were still whispered, bones still returned to the river. Even as schools forbade the Ainu language, some words survived only in the context of fishing. The line beneath the ice became a line to identity. Candle closing thoughts. What survives of a people when their lands are taken, their gods are outlawed, and their children are taught to forget? For the Ainu, survival did not always mean resistance with weapons. Sometimes, it meant casting a line beneath the ice, in the same place your grandmother did. It meant praying quietly when no one could hear, and blessing a fish even if no one believed you should. In the biting wind of winter, these small acts were not just tradition, they were a declaration. And so we ask, in the face of erasure, what quiet rituals might we each carry to remember who we are? Wind faced the melting edge of memory. The 20th century arrived in Hokkaido with paved roads, electricity, rail lines, and an accelerating disappearance of icebound traditions. By the early 1900s, Ainu winter fishing, once a defining act of cultural resilience and spiritual rhythm, had become a quiet relic, practiced by fewer families each year. Not because the rivers were empty or the fish were gone, but because the framework that supported Ainu ritual life had been eroded, by policy, by pressure, and by time. In this final section, we trace the last echoes of traditional Ainu ice fishing, how it was recorded, remembered, and in some cases revived. We'll explore what survives when a tradition becomes too fragile to continue in practice, yet too meaningful to forget. This is not a story of disappearance. It is a story of preservation, in notebooks, in oral memory, and, ultimately, in the frozen waters of Hokkaido that still bear witness to a people's quiet survival. Books, anthropologists, and the archive. As early as the late 1800s, Japanese and foreign anthropologists began to document Ainu culture. Some were sympathetic, others less so. But almost all were drawn to the ritual life of fishing, particularly winter practices, which seemed untouched by modernization. One notable figure was Bronislaw Pilsudski, a Polish exile in Japan and a pioneer in Ainu ethnography. Between 1902 and 1905, he lived among the Ainu, recording hundreds of words, chants, and stories. Among his notes were observations like, "During winter fishing, the men carve a hole in the ice and speak softly into it, a phrase I heard many times. You return when you are ready, fish of the cold river." Such fragments, however mundane they might seem, represent some of the last direct records of traditional winter rituals before they faded. Other Japanese scholars compiled folk tales and ritual transcripts, including detailed descriptions of how fish bones were aligned before burial, the exact dimensions of ceremonial and near fishing holes, seasonal prohibitions against fishing on certain days without permission from the river Cam. These studies, dry as they may be, became a kind of preservation net, catching what remained before it slipped beneath the ice of history. Snowflake, the disappearance of the practice. By the mid-20th century, several factors had accelerated the decline of Ainu winter fishing. Government assimilation policies banned spiritual practices. Dams and water control projects disrupted natural fish migration patterns. Urban migration drew younger generations away from rivers and villages. The global introduction of industrial fishing tools and methods rendered traditional practices inefficient. Perhaps more subtly, the freezing patterns themselves began to change. Hokkaido's winters became less predictable. Some rivers no longer froze thick enough to support human weight. Climate change was eroding not just cultural memory, but the physical stage on which those memories had been performed. And yet some elders continued. In small, icy tributaries near Asahikawa and Abashiri, they fished quietly without ceremony, but still with care. Their ino were simpler, their words fewer, but the intention remained. One elderly Ainu woman, interviewed in the 1960s, said, "My father told me never to take the first fish without saying thank you. I do not pray the way he did, but I still say thank you." Revivals and reimaginings. The late 20th and early 21st centuries brought a wave of Ainu cultural revival. With growing recognition of indigenous rights in Japan, including the 2019 legal declaration recognizing the Ainu as Japan's indigenous people, younger generations began to recover forgotten practices. In some villages, winter fishing was reintroduced, not always in its full spiritual form, but as part of cultural education programs for Ainu youth. Within reconstructed rituals meant to honor ancestral practices. As community gatherings, blending memory with experience. In the town of Bairotori, a group of elders taught children how to carve a fishing hole using a replica adze, prepare smoked smelt using traditional methods, offer a chant, simplified perhaps but heartfelt, to the river spirit. Even in urban centers like Sapporo, museums and cultural centers began hosting ice fishing demonstrations, coupled with exhibits on Ainu beliefs about the river and cold. What had once been survival and then resistance was now reclamation. Milky Way memory under the ice. What does it mean to remember something you have never done? For many younger Ainu today, winter ice fishing is no longer a lived experience, but a remembered tradition passed through. Grandparents' stories, archival recordings, fragments of songs, museum exhibits. But even memories evolve. Some youth now integrate old practices with new forms, combining modern fishing gear with ancestral rituals, sharing photos on social media with captions in both Japanese and Ainu, or writing poems inspired by the idea of a winter prayer whispered into an ice hole. This too is culture. It may not look like the past, but it listens to it. Repeat button, the circle of offering. In Ainu thought, life is a cycle of giving and receiving. When a fish is caught, its spirit returns to the land of the kami, only to be reborn and gifted again. When a tradition is lost, it can still be remembered, retold, and perhaps reborn in another form. Thus, even if winter fishing is no longer central to Ainu daily life, its principles persist. Gratitude for nature's gifts. Balance in harvest. Silence as reverence. Ritual as continuity. These ideas may no longer require a frozen river to thrive. They can live in the city, in classrooms, or even in digital archives. But they began beneath the ice, in the hush of winter, beside a small hole in the snow, where a fisherman whispered to the spirits. Candle final reflection. What is preserved when a tradition disappears from daily life? What remains when the tools are put away, the chants grow faint, and the ice no longer forms? For the Ainu, the answer may be this: intention. Even when the rivers no longer freeze, even when no hand reaches through the cold for a fish, the memory of respect, rhythm, and relationship endures. It waits, perhaps, for a season colder than this, when the old songs might again find their breath in the frost. And so we ask, when the ice is gone, how do we keep listening to what once lived beneath it? Story 8: The Ice Beneath the Empire. Russian peasant fishing under the czars. Wind face a nation under snow. Russia is a land of seasons, mostly winter. For much of its territory, the landscape freezes for half the year or more. Snow silences the forests, rivers turn to highways of ice, and daily life continues with an endurance that outsiders often mistake for stoicism. But beneath this deep cold lies a world of intricate activity, a web of winter routines so old they stretch beyond memory. Among the oldest of these winter traditions is ice fishing, particularly among Russia's vast peasant population during the rule of the czars. From the frozen banks of the Volga to the ice-covered lakes of Karelia, peasants carved holes in the ice not for sport or leisure, but for survival. This is not the story of aristocrats or generals. It is not about palace life or great battles. It is about frozen hands, homemade augers, and the quiet persistence of people who fished not to live better, but simply to live. In this first section, we step onto the brittle crust of a Russian river in the 17th century. The Tsar is a distant figure in Moscow. The world is ruled instead by the demands of the seasons, the behavior of fish, and the freezing breath of wind against the back of a scarfless neck. Let us walk with the Russian muzhik, the peasant fisherman, and see what winter demanded of him. Water wave life by the frozen river. Throughout Russia's rural heartlands, especially in the central Volga region, rivers were both artery and larder. Fishing was often one of the few consistent food sources available throughout the year. In summer and fall, peasants cast nets and set traps, but in winter, their relationship with the water changed. It became a conversation through ice. Fishing families knew which parts of the river froze thick enough to support a man or a horse, where water flowed slow enough that fish might rest, what days in the church calendar allowed or forbade meat, and thus increased fish demand, how long the barreled or salted catch would last during Lent, when Orthodox fasts required meat abstinence. The Volga and its tributaries became not just places to fish, but sites of timed extraction, tied to both spiritual obligation and physical necessity. Hammer and wrench, the tools of the Russian peasant fisherman. Ice fishing was not possible without tools, many of which were handmade and passed down through families. These implements were rustic but ingeniously suited to the task. Typical gear included: 1 sverlo auger, a spiral-bladed hand drill used to bore through thick ice. Early forms were carved from hardwood or iron and required 2 men to operate, 1 to anchor and 1 to turn. 2 zherlitsa tip-up trap, a passive fishing device, a stick laid over a hole in the ice with a line and baited hook beneath. When a fish took the bait, a flag or twig would tip, alerting the fisherman. This method allowed multiple holes to be monitored at once. 3 pechushka scoop ladle, a long-handled scoop used to clear ice chips from the hole and prevent refreezing. 4 korzena basket, woven from birch or willow. These baskets held the catch and were insulated with straw or moss to prevent freezing. Clothing too was adapted, peasants wore valenki, thick felt boots that could withstand long exposure to snow. Telegreka, padded jackets filled with cotton or wool. Ashenka, ear flap hats tied tightly under the chin. And shuba, heavy fur coats, when available, though most peasants could only afford sheepskin. Despite all of this, frostbite was common. Many returned from the river with numb fingers, bleeding knuckles, or frostbitten ears, but still considered themselves lucky if they returned with a full basket of perch or pike. Fish what they fished and why. The Russian peasants' catch depended on location, depth of ice, and season. In the Volga region, typical winter species included okun perch, aggressive and easier to bait in winter; Sachuka pike, highly valued for size and oil content; Sudek zander, prized for its delicate white flesh; Platva roach, common though smaller and less meaty; Nalim burbot, a cold water fish that thrived under the ice and was considered especially nourishing. Fish were rarely eaten fresh, most were salted in brine barrels, stored in root cellars, smoked over birchwood fires, which also helped preserve them, dried on racks outdoors, then brought inside before storms. This preservation allowed families to survive the Orthodox fasting periods, especially Great Lent and Nativity fast, during which meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden, leaving fish as the primary source of animal protein. Fishing, then, was not just practical. It was liturgical, aligned with the rhythms of both the earth and the church. Church between church and cold. Despite their spiritual importance, fish and fishermen were considered marginal in both religious and social hierarchies. Peasant fishermen occupied a low rung in the Russian class structure. Their work was seen as humble, even dirty, and they were often taxed in fish by local lords or monasteries. Yet ironically, the very same monasteries depended on their catch to feed the monastic communities during fasting seasons. It was not uncommon for peasants to be contracted or conscripted to deliver a quota of dried fish to the church by mid-Lent; fishing families to receive scriptural blessings or small indulgences for regular delivery; excess catch to be used in barter, exchanged for grain, fabric, or tools. Still, the peasant fishermen remained at the mercy of the seasons, the church calendar, and the czar's taxes. Fishing as folklore. Fishing under ice inspired a unique body of Russian folklore and superstition. Among the most enduring beliefs: don't speak loudly near the hole, or the fish will hear and flee. Offer a drop of vodka to the hole before the first catch to appease the water spirit. Never eat the first fish. It must be returned to the river to ensure a good season. Avoid fishing on Wednesdays and Fridays, unless exempted by clergy. One tale told of a man who cursed the river when his net came up empty. That night, he dreamed of a woman made of snow who dragged him beneath the ice, whispering, "You took without thanks." Children were taught early not just how to fish, but how to respect the hole as a portal, not just a workplace. Candle closing thoughts. The Russian Empire was vast, its winters long and its peasants poor. But beneath the crust of every frozen river lay the thin thread of survival, pulled up hand over hand, day after day. The fisherman beneath the Tsar's gaze was rarely seen, rarely praised. Yet he kept families alive. He observed sacred rhythms. He walked miles in the snow to carve a circle into ice, cast a line into blackness, and wait, not for wealth, but for just enough. And so we ask, in the scale of empires, how often do we forget the hands that pulled food from frozen water so others might pray, rule, or feast? Snowflake, a market of ice and salt. In Tsarist Russia, where class divisions were vast and winter seemingly endless, the humble fish became a cornerstone of the informal rural economy. While the nobility collected taxes and the Orthodox Church dictated fasting days, it was the frozen catch of poor fishermen that kept communities, both peasant and clerical, alive during the most barren months of the year. This section explores how ice fishing under the Tsars evolved from mere subsistence into a vital link in the broader feudal economy. We'll examine the barter and taxation systems that governed fish distribution, The role of